All right, good afternoon. We'll go ahead and call to order the City of Murfreesboro Board of Zoning Appeals regular meeting for May 27, 2009. The first item on the agenda is a consideration of minutes for the regular meeting on April 22, 2009. Those minutes were included with your agenda and materials. Are there any changes to those minutes? No. If not, those minutes then will stand approved as presented. Moving on now to new business. First item under variance request is application Z09030 by Ms. Beth Smith for Rutherford County Habitat for Humanity, requesting a 15-foot variance of the minimum required 30-foot front setback for principal structures, a 5-foot variance of the minimum required 20-foot rear setback for principal structures, and a 12-foot variance of the minimum required 60-foot front setback for accessory structures in a medical residential zone for property located at 716 Lee Street. And Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Rogers, and good afternoon, Chairman Rogers and members of the board. As Chairman Rogers mentioned, our first item is a variance request at 716 Lee Street, Zone CMR, which is our transitional medical/residential zoning district. The applicant is Ms. Beth Smith for Habitat for Humanity. She is requesting the three variances that Chairman Rogers just went over. And just to acquaint you with the property a little bit, I'll show you on the overhead. There we go. It's along the east side of Lee Street. It's currently a vacant piece of property, approximately 67 feet deep. And as you can see, it's just to the Lee Street being a street that runs parallel to North Highland Avenue. North Highland is just to the east of the subject property. Here you can see on this block the proximity of the existing houses to the front property line along Lee Street. As I mentioned a moment ago, the lot is 67 feet deep and 93 feet wide, so it's actually wider than it is deep. And the depth of the lot is the primary reason that the applicant has requested these setback variants. You'll see the proposed building footprint on the overhead in front of you. The applicant is actually requesting a 15-foot front setback variance to the minimum required 30-foot front setback in the CMR zoning district, although you can tell by the plot plan that's been submitted that it is actually shown as being 19 feet off of that front property line. The applicant is requesting a little bit of flexibility with regards to the setback variances because of some unknowns that might come up with regards to where they can and can't place that house. I believe that the applicant said the former house that was on the property had a basement, and they're going to have to work around or possibly do some work to fill in that basement, and that may alter where they place the house itself. And as you can see, the separation from the rear property line is proposed at being 16 feet. They're asking actually for a 5-foot rear setback variance, once again to add a little bit of flexibility. With the depth of the lot being only 67 feet, and with a 30-foot front setback requirement and a 20-foot rear setback requirement, it allows only a 17-foot deep building envelope, which for all intents and purposes renders the lot unbuildable for a single-family residence to be only 17 feet deep. In addition to the setback variances on the front and the rear for the principal structure, the applicant is also requesting a front setback variance for the accessory structure. Most habitat lots in the city limits of Murfreesboro have an 8x12 storage shed that they build on the subject property. Well, as you can imagine, with a 60-foot front setback requirement for an accessory structure in the CMR zoning district and a 5-foot rear setback, that allows only a 2-foot building envelope for a 2-foot deep building envelope for accessory structures. With that being said, they're requesting a variance to that minimum 60-foot front setback for the accessory structure, the 12-foot variance to be exact. Staff believes the subject lot is a good candidate for the variance requests for the reason that I mentioned earlier, with the depth of the lot being what it is. Also, the applicant, as you know, has attempted in the past to build houses that are compatible and harmonious with the surrounding neighborhood, built in reasonable conformance to the position of the existing houses in the neighborhood. In addition, the request is generally consistent with the recommendations of the Manny Avenue Comprehensive Plan, which the Board and the Planning Commission and staff use as a tool for planning in the area. The plan identifies the subject property as being in the Oaklands Mansion Residential District. With regards to the Oaklands Mansion Residential District, the plan recommends as a key design standard reduced front setbacks to better relate homes to the street. It recommends a minimum front setback of 15 feet and a maximum front setback of 25 feet. If the board approves this application, staff recommends the following condition. A surveyor will be required to help lay out the footing of the building, and a surveyor's certification must be provided that the building is in compliance with the action of the BZA as well as all other setback requirements. And I know one of the concerns that the BZA always has when we look at front setback variance requests, and we pull the overhead back up on the screen, is the adequacy of off-street parking. And you'll see that because of the width of the lot, not necessarily being an issue, it's the depth of the lot. With the width of the lot, there is enough room for a driveway coming in off of Lee Street to the south of the proposed house that will be able to accommodate the minimum required number of off-street parking spaces. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Ms. Beth Smith and Mr. Roy Saylor from Habitat for Humanity are here if you have any questions for them.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, Ms. Smith, anything, or Mr. Saylor, anything you all would like to add to this application? No, sir. All right. At this time, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward to the podium, state your name, address, and any comments that you may have. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion.
And I will mention that each variance will need to be taken in a separate motion.
Chairman Rogers, if there is no discussion, I like to make a motion that we approve the 5-foot variance, 15-foot variance of the minimum required 30-foot front setback, subject to all conditions that Matthew proposed.
Second.
Now we have a motion and a second to approve the 15-foot variance of the minimum required 30-foot front setback for principal structures. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we'll next move to the request for a 5-foot variance of the minimum required 20-foot rear setback.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the 5-foot variance of the minimum required 20-foot rear setback with all conditions being considered.
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, and then finally we'll address the request for a 12-foot variance of the minimum required 60-foot front setback for accessory structures.
Mr. Chairman, I'll move approval of the 12-foot variance on the 60-foot setback for accessory structures, subject to staff comments.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Ms. Smith, Mr. Saylor, those applications have been granted. Thank you very much. Appreciate you all coming in today. All right, next item on the agenda under special use permits and variance requests is application Z09031 by Mr. Jeff Hooper of Barge, Coffin and Associates for Rutherford County Board of Education, requesting a special use permit in order to construct an institutional group assembly use, a middle school, in a residential single-family RS-15 zone. This is for property located at 5555 Manchester Pike. Now, the applicant is also requesting a 6-foot variance of the 35-foot maximum permitted building height in an RS-15 zone in order to allow a 41-foot tall structure. And Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Rogers. As you mentioned, the subject property is at 5555 Manchester Pike. I'm sure many of you have read in the papers with regard to discussion of the Rutherford County Board of Education with the construction of 2 new middle schools that are proposed. These are the subject of our next 2 items on the Board of Zoning Appeals. We'll first take under consideration the proposed Buchanan area middle school, which will be on Manchester Pike, and then the next public hearing will be with regards to the Oakland area middle school, which will be taken as a separate matter, of course. The subject property is located along the east side of Manchester Pike, directly across the street from where Elam Road dead ends into Manchester Pike. And this is just a little bit south of the Joe B. Jackson Parkway intersection with Manchester Pike. And we can pull up the aerial photograph. It's kind of it's such a large piece of property. It's kind of the photograph is zoomed out quite a bit. But here's where Elam Road currently dead ends into Manchester Pike. And the subject property runs along like so, kind of bows back here in the back, and has its frontage here along Manchester Pike. The surrounding land uses in the subject area are predominantly large lot single-family residential uses, and predominantly in the county as well. This property is pending annexation right now before the City Council. And, of course, one of staff's recommended conditions of approval is that if the board decides to approve this request, that any approval be subject to the annexation of this property passing third and final reading and becoming effective before our City Council. The site plan for the subject property has been approved by the Planning Commission subject to Board of Zoning Appeals special use permit approval. Now I'll kind of walk you through the site plan right now. Here's the frontage along Manchester Pike. There will be a new private street constructed along the western boundary or near the western boundary of the site, running back into the property. There's been discussions about making that a public street at some point in the future, but for the time being, that will remain a private drive, although it will be built to city standards, so that in case it is dedicated as public right-of-way in the future, it will be built up to standard. Towards the front of the site is where you will see the proposed practice fields for the middle school. And as you get further back into the site, you'll see the proposed middle school facility itself. Now, all of the practice fields will be unlit. There will be a small parking area here that will have some lighting, but for the most part, the lighting on site will be predominantly limited to the parking areas around the school and the school itself. Now, if we look at the extreme back side of the property, which would be the northernmost portion of the property, the applicant is showing a proposed future high school. Now, this high school is not a component of this special use permit request. The applicants are simply showing that as their future intentions. Now, when and if that will happen, we don't know the timetable on that, but they're showing you right now what their intentions are in the future. Now, with the high school would come the associated athletic facilities that would accompany a high school. But at this point, all that we have are the 4 unlit practice fields, which would include softball, baseball, soccer, and football. The total size of the proposed site is 91.4 acres, and that includes both the site that's being requested right now, or the portion of the site that's being requested right now for the middle school, as well as the portion that will be remaining for the high school should the Board of Education decide to pursue that. The proposed middle school facility will be 162,265 square feet. And the proposed middle school will accommodate approximately 1,100 students and 85 staff members, according to the applicant. The site meets the minimum parking requirements and, in fact, exceeds the minimum parking requirements, and no parking areas are proposed to be located in the required front yard. The lot size meets minimum lot size requirements. The applicant has stated that the only outdoor amplification will be for fire drills, and that there will be no other types of loudspeakers on site. As mentioned previously, the 4 practice fields will not have any outdoor lighting, nor will they be used after daylight hours. The photometric lighting plan that's been submitted, that's in your package of plans, shows very little lighting spillover to the neighboring properties. With regards to the screening of the proposed use, the applicant plans to utilize the existing tree line along the property lines and supplement it where needed. If the board approves the special use permit request, staff recommends the following conditions. As I mentioned a moment ago, the City Council must approve the annexation of this property on third and final reading, and the annexation must become effective. Number 2, the existing tree line along the property lines must not be disturbed, as they've committed to, and must remain intact. The landscape plan will be subject to the final review and approval of the city horticulturist. With regards to the building, there's a second request, as you mentioned in the intro. The applicant is proposing a 6-foot height variance for the gymnasium building. And the gymnasium is what would be considered a routine component of a middle school facility. Middle schools, as an institutional group assembly use, are permitted by special use permit in the RS-15 zoning district, and this property would come into the city limits within the RS-15 zoning classification if annexed. And as such, in building a middle school, in order to achieve the height of the building, in order to make it a functional gymnasium, the applicants are requesting that 6-foot height variance in order to construct the gymnasium. They pointed out in their application that it will be approximately 173 feet from the nearest property line, so as not to be an imposing structure adjacent to the property line. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Well, before we do that, I did want to show you just some photographs of the site itself. We did not have time to visit the site on the ride around this morning. This is looking north on Manchester Pike, the site being to the right of this photograph. This is looking directly across the street from the school site. This is looking south on Manchester Pike. There was a single-family residence on the subject property that the school board is actually removing from the subject property. And here I'll just show you kind of a panoramic view of the site. It's hard to do justice to a site that large in photographs. And with that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing. And Ms. Sarah Hooper, you're doing the other one. Ms. Sarah Hooper will be here representing the application if you have any questions for her.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley?
Mr. Blomley, is anybody, I assume there's going to be some traffic issues on Manchester Pike with addition of the school. Does this plan address any of those? Has that been talked about by staff? Is there going to be a turn lane or any sort of, can you address what's going on with that?
Sure, and actually, the more technical nature of the site plan, those were predominantly discussed during the site plan review process before the applicant went to the Planning Commission, and I actually like Ms. Hooper to address that question if she could.
Sure.
If you come to the podium.
Yes, sir. We're adding a left turn lane into the school as well as a right turn lane. It's part of the site plan, so we'll address the increase in traffic that way.
So there'll be turn lanes coming both ways into the site.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And that went to planning, and they were okay with all that?
Yep, planning has seen the engineering, and we'll get the proper TDOT permit prior to construction.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, I'm sorry, Sarah Hooper with Barge, Coffin and Associates.
Ms. Hooper, it looks like we're done with Mr. Blomley, so hang on, we may have some more
Sure.
questions for you, okay? Any other questions for Ms. Hooper?
You know, if it will be a red light there, to kind of,
There
The
isn't,
traffic's so bad out
there's
there.
not one planned right now. The traffic engineer with the city is satisfied with the improvements that we're making at this time, and there's no plan for a signal at this time.
And Ms. Mosby, one of the things that we have to remember with regards to Manchester Pike is that it is a state highway, and the state has pretty stringent criteria as far as not wanting to put traffic signals up before they're warranted. So I'm sure that's something that our traffic department will be looking at, so that when it is warranted and meets the state's criteria, that there wouldn't be a delay as far as that goes.
That was my concern. It seems like the things are focusing on the traffic coming in and out of the school, and particularly in light of the prospect of a high school being built back there. As far as traffic counts go, everyone's comfortable with the volume of traffic coming in and out of this one exit point?
Yes, sir, and at this time, there are no concrete plans for a high school. There's, it's just in their future plan, but there's no, plan to move forward with that, at this time. So, I think when
Assuming there is a high school built there, though, is this
I think at
access
that,
point adequate to service both middle school and high school traffic?
I believe so, and when the high school is designed, we'll revisit that issue and, resubmit plans for the city review of the high school, and they'll look at traffic again at that time and assess the situation.
Are there any other real opportunities to create an access point, a separate access point?
The only other real opportunity is, as Mr. Blumley mentioned, the main drive into the school. It's proposed right now to be a public, or not a public, a private access, but it's there is a potential in the future for it to become a public road. If that happens, it would actually connect to a future roadway that would go through the Jones Foundation property. So there is potential in the future for there to be another roadway, another access point to the high school. But that's just in the preliminary stages at this point. Nothing's been decided, but there is that future.
Okay, that's a roadway
there's that
that's a
potential for
road
the
that would cut through this Jones property here.
Correct. Yes.
William Ransom Jones.
With the construction of the at a point in time when the Jones Foundation is ready to move forward, one of the things that will be a component of their plan will be the extension of the Joe B. Jackson Parkway through that property, which will be the first leg in. Well, I don't want to speak out of turn. I don't know the timetable of that construction, but it will be a major element of the development of the Jones property, and that will be an extension of the Joe B. Jackson Parkway east of Manchester Pike to eventually loop back up to John Bragg Highway. And I think what we're talking about is eventually this street having connectivity to that extension of the Joe B. Jackson Parkway. But timetables on all of that are still to be determined.
We received a copy of their conceptual plan, and compared it to what we had, and tried to align our future roadway with their future roadway, and we definitely considered that in laying out the roadway.
I asked this question with great trepidation. How set in stone are the layout of the athletic fields?
Well, at this point, they're just practice fields. We show all the markings and everything kind of just for reference, but at this point, they're just practice fields.
Okay, but I guess my question is, let's say they're just practice fields, and how definitive is the layout for even the practice fields?
I think, Trey, do you want to answer that question for him? This is Mr. Trey Lee with the Rutherford County Board of Education. I think he could answer that a little bit better for you.
Trey Lee, Rutherford County Board of Education. The practice fields for the middle school are pretty well set in stone. They will remain practice fields. The future high school fields, they're fairly set. There is some flexibility there. At this point in time, we don't see the high school being built here for 10, I mean, it's not even on the radar right now, but with the proposed property, we did take the potential to do the future layout so that we could use the property to its fullest at a future time.
Because as shown, there are no facilities for high school baseball. Are these going to be combined athletic
They'll end up being
facilities?
combined at some time, and when that's the purpose for the parking lot, so that when they are combined in a future, that they can be. They're designed for high school, and all of our middle schools are. We just don't put any lighting and no fences. We just put backstops in their practice fields. They actually play at high schools or other facilities.
But that's not true for middle schools in Rutherford County.
We have no
For most-
lighting of middle schools in Rutherford County.
I agree, but they play. They play.
Some of the
at
schools do.
schools.
As the schools progress, and they're able to raise funds and fence and build dugouts, then they are allowed to play, but they don't do any lighting, so they only play during the daylight hours.
Chairman Rogers, one thing to point out is if in the future they did decide to combine the middle school practice fields being to be used also for the high school fields, if that high school was built and they decided to go back and light these fields, that would have to be a component of the special use permit for the high school, and they would have to come back and demonstrate that the lighting for those fields would not have a negative impact on the surrounding properties. As it would be today, if you approve their request as presented, it would be for unlit fields only. And if the fields were to be lighted in the future, that would have to come back to the board as a special use permit amendment or a brand new special use permit request if they were to do it at such time as they have made application for the high school.
Okay, let me ask you one more question. Why don't you back up the softball and baseball facilities so that they can better utilize common resources like concession stands and
Those are fairly close right there, so they could. We've done that at Rockvale. The last project that we built, we did it at Rockvale, and the ones that you'll see here shortly at Oakland, they're close together so that you could has common use.
It was not possible on this site?
It's as far as a concession stand or something like that, it would be possible because they're right back to back with the parking lot between them. So you would have common use there.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any more questions?
All right, any other questions?
I have one for Matthew. The issue with the lighting, we know you said they had to have to come back. I assume that would be true for any sort of public address or any, because we talked about no outside speakers and things like that. So that would be also require them to come back at whatever, if they had games there, they were during the day, but they were using public address or any other sort of something that would be more invasive than they're showing just for practices. Would that also require them to come back?
That is correct. As of right now, they've represented that the only outdoor amplification will be for fire drills only. As far as any outdoor amplification at the fields themselves, if Mr. Lee wouldn't mind clarifying that or confirming that will not be, that's not a part of this application, you could come back to the podium.
Sorry, I thought that was a Matthew question. I
Well,
grabbed you.
Well, I want
understand.
to make sure that I understand it correctly as well.
Any lighting or amplification or future fences would have to come back before this board.
And no amplification at the practice fields are proposed at this time, correct?
That is correct.
right, if there are no further questions, then we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussion. I believe we have two separate issues that we need to take up. Have the special use permit request, which we'll take separately from the variance, 6-foot variance request.
When's the online date, or when does this, when would this be? What school year would this be? Next August.
So they're about a little over a year out.
Mm-hmm.
So y'all are ready to start pretty quickly, I mean, for once approval.
They've broken ground.
They already dug up some
At
stuff.
Dejohnette, I know they have.
Both sides.
If there is no further discussion, I'll make a motion that we approve this special use permit subject to all staff comments and the approval of annexation by the city council.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that portion of the application is granted. Moving on then to the 6-foot variance of the 35-foot maximum permitted building height in an RS-15 zone. We have a motion on that.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the 6-foot variance with staff recommendations.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Mr. Hooper, that application has been granted. We'll next consider application Z09032 by Mr. Jeff Hooper of Barge, Coffin and Associates for Rutherford County Board of Education, requesting a special use permit in order to construct an institutional group assembly use, a middle school, in a residential single-family RS-15 zone. This is for property located at 853 Dejohnette Lane. The applicant is also requesting a 6-foot variance of the 35-foot maximum permitted building height in an RS-15 zone in order to allow a 41-foot tall structure. And lastly, the applicant is requesting a 28-foot variance of the requirement that no parking shall be allowed in the required 40-foot front yard along the proposed Cushing Avenue extension. Mr. Blumley, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. The subject property is located along the north side of Dejohnette Lane. It is directly to the the east of the John Pittard Elementary School and to the north of Oakland High School. As I mentioned before, this is the second of two requests by the Rutherford County Board of Education for a new middle school facility. Now, as with the last request, this particular property is also pending annexation by our City Council, and any approval would need to be made subject to the annexation passing third and final reading and becoming effective. I'll show you the property right now. Actually, this parcel here, as well as this parcel here, two separate parcels. Directly to the west of the subject property is a large lot, single-family residence, and here is the John Pittard Elementary School, which, as you can see, was under construction when this particular photograph was taken 2 years ago. To the north, due north, and to the northwest of the subject property is the Huntington Place subdivision. And you can see this section of Huntington Place is currently under construction. It was 2 years ago when this photograph was taken. And at this point, the plat has not been recorded yet. The streets, however, are in and is getting closer and closer to being recorded. And a little bit off there we go, just to the north of the subject property, there are some existing single-family residences along that northern lot line. And one thing to bear in mind is, as I get into the design of the site, you'll see that Cushing Avenue currently stubs out into the subject property, which will have bearing on what I'm about to show you with the design of the site itself. See what the proposed site design consists of along the eastern boundary of the subject property is the extension of Cushing Avenue. Now, Cushing is a street, as I mentioned, that stubs out from the Huntington Place subdivision into the subject property for, stubbed out for the purposes of future extension, regardless of what was built or what was developed on the subject property. This is an important linkage that staff has worked with the applicants on establishing this linkage, and it also creates secondary access points into the site. You'll see here along Dejohnette Lane you have one access point into the site. From Dejohnette Lane, you'll have the middle school building directly fronting Dejohnette Lane, and along the eastern boundary will actually be Cushing Avenue, which will form the eastern boundary of the subject property, and that will be dedicated as a public right-of-way and built to city standards as a 3-lane cross-section with curb and gutter, and will be dedicated as public right-of-way. So it will actually be a double frontage lot with frontage on Dejohnette and the new Cushing Lane extension, Cushing Avenue. I've called it everything but Cushing Avenue. Called it Cushing Drive, Cushing Lane. At any rate, as you get further to the north in the site, you'll see that there are the same 4 types of practice fields that were shown on the Buchanan area middle school site. You've got a football practice field, soccer practice fields, baseball and softball practice fields. Much the same as with the Buchanan area middle school, these 4 practice fields will not be lit and will only be used during daylight hours. Now, the building itself will be 162,000 square feet, 162,200. The total area of the site is 30.2 acres, and much the same as the previous request, it will house 1,100 middle school students as well as 85 staff members. I've already described for you the access into the site. With regards to the specific standards for institutional group assembly uses, the site meets minimum parking requirements, and no parking areas are located in the required front yard along Dejohnette Lane. However, one of the variance requests that we have is that the applicant is seeking relief from that requirement of no parking being located in the required front yard along Cushing Avenue, which will be, as I mentioned, a public right-of-way. And if we could bring the site plan back up, there are certain points along Cushing Avenue. You'll see that the parking is, there's parking to the east of the school site in between Cushing Avenue and the school building itself. Most of that parking will be approximately 25 feet off of that eastern front property line, which means there will be approximately 25 feet of green space there instead of 40 feet green space, which is what is required for an institutional group assembly use. But however, we've advertised it as actually a 28-foot variance to the requirement that no parking shall be allowed in the required 40-foot front yard. And that's not a blanket approval for 28 feet into that required front yard. That is because there's one point where the parking actually juts out into that required front yard about 28 feet. But the majority of the parking lot will actually be only about 15 feet into that required front setback. We have received a photometric lighting plan showing that lighting levels are very low, or if not negligible, at the property lines. And as I mentioned, directly adjacent to the residences will be the practice fields, which will not be lit. The lighting will be concentrated in the parking areas along around the middle school and adjacent to the parking areas adjacent to the middle school as well. As with the last request, the applicants are requesting a height variance for the gymnasium, and I'll show you where the gymnasium is proposed to be located. It is proposed to be located in this back left-hand corner of the school building itself. So if the board approves the special use permit request, staff recommends the following conditions. The City Council must approve the annexation of this property on third and final reading, and the annexation must become effective. And 2, the existing tree line along the property lines must not be disturbed and must remain intact. The landscape plan will be subject to the final review and approval of the city horticulturist. Which brings me to a point of discussion that I wanted to bring up for the board to discuss. Along the northern property line, As I mentioned, there are about 5 or 6 lots along that northern property line with developed single-family homes. After I initially went out to the site and put the zoning signs up and did my site visit, a number of the trees were actually removed from this property line. There's still a tree row left along that property line. However, it's much less dense than when I went out there originally. And one of my comments was going to be that I personally would like for the board to discuss ways to mitigate the impact on those existing houses with some additional plantings along that property line. And that would be consistent with what we've required of institutional group assemblies in the past, just in order to protect those existing homes along that rear property line. Now I'll show you some photographs of the site itself. This is looking from Dejohnette Lane along to the east. This would be the eastern side of the site. This is looking into the site here. And then once again looking kind of just panning back over towards the west. And that existing house directly to the west is right in that area there. And looking straight down the west, there's the John Pittard Elementary School, which is 2 lots down. This is from the north side of the site. This is looking at the Cushing Avenue stub into the school property. And this is looking directly south from that Cushing Avenue stub. And this is looking to the west along that. This is the house that's right on the corner of Cushing and the street to the north. And this is, as you can see, this was more dense tree line when I took these photographs. There's a picture of the tree line. And now essentially it's a single stand of trees along that property line. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing. Mr. Hooper is not actually here, but Mr. Seth Sparkman with Barge, Coffin and Associates is here representing this request.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, if not, Mr. Sparkman, is that right? Anything you'd like to add to this application, sir?
No, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions for Mr. Sparkman? I'm sorry, I cannot resist. I'm going to maybe come back and pick on Mr. Lee a little bit more. This site looks laid out a little bit better than the site on Manchester Highway, but it might be because of just the sheer site or layout of the property as it's defined. My question, though, is there, and I'm just sensitive to this, the layout of the baseball and softball fields, can they not be combined so that you can utilize, so that you bring the home plates closer together so that you can and I say this because I'm part of the booster organization. I realize the difficulty in raising money for something like this. It might not be possible to bring those home plates closer together so that you can utilize a common concession stand, press box area rather than splitting them up like they've done on this site. If there's a rational basis for splitting up, then that's fine, but I was just, you all are here for suggestions, and just my suggestion, if nothing else. Okay.
Yeah, as far as I know,
Okay.
no reason.
All right. Well, that having been said, my 2 cents having been put in. Anything else? All right, then we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Thank you, Mr. Sparkman. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward. Yes, sir. You would state your name and address and any comments that you might have.
My name's James Dutton. I live at 1924 Walking Drive, corner of Walking and Cushing Avenue. New resident to Murfreesboro. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, board members. Just for the record, I'm the one that the picture you just saw, the corner house with the fence. I do want to address 3 issues. Just for the record, I am concerned about of course, the traffic is going to pick up considerably down Cushing Avenue as a way to get to the Dejohnette Avenue. That concerns me. I don't know what I can do about that. Probably nothing, but that is a concern that I have. The trees along the border on the north side of the property, as you could see there where he showed the picture of a fairly adequate tree line, that basically consists, at least on my property, of 1 mature tree. The undergrowth, which provided the majority of the screening, if you would, is gone. So I would like for that to be a requirement that they come back in and screen that area adequately, as to provide some screening from that developed area. Which brings me to my third concern, and I'll echo what the chairman said. My question exactly as to why you would need to utilize 2 separate ball fields, softball, baseball. In the layout, they have actually the softball field on the north corner side there, which is basically in the backyard of those 5 properties, mine and the neighbors as well. It's in very close proximity, looking at the blueprints, to our property line. Now, with not having any shielding there, that seems inadequate to me. I would like to know why they couldn't utilize 1 ball field and make, perhaps, take the softball field out of the equation, and that would provide a fairly good-sized buffer between the residents and the fields. So for the record, I just wanted to voice those concerns, and hopefully they can put something in the plan to put some of those trees, replant some things to help us out there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Dutton. Any questions for Mr. Dutton?
Mr. Dutton, if you would, step back up there. As we're looking at this photograph here at the corner of your property, do you know how many of these trees are yours and how many of those are on the county's property? Have you looked at your stakes in the back of your property?
Right. The trees that were on my property, they were pretty much along the property line. There were some trees and some growth that was on the other side, on the property line, but they've taken all of that out.
So what we saw when we went out there today would be you believe to be on your property, is that right? Or do you know? Do you really know which of those trees that remain?
If you went out to the property...
We were out there today.
Today. What you see, there was a single tree back there. I believe that's on my property. But there's little else there. There's nothing else. It looks nothing like the photograph that was shown earlier. And that extends all the way down the northern side of the property. I understand that a lot of what was there was on the other property line, but with being concerned about screening and bufferage between the ball field and the residence, I would have thought that they would have left some
Sure.
undergrowth there.
Gotcha.
The mature trees that are there, they're mature trees, which is what they left, but it provides nothing in the way of actually screening the property. So before, none of the residents on that side of the north side could see anything. Now we see all the way clear to Dejohnette. So that's an issue that concerns me, and I would very much like that to be addressed if possible.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Dutton. Anyone else wishing to speak for or against this application?
I'm Ron Sissel, and I live at 1908 Walking Drive, and if you were there this morning, you saw the house with the white fence. That was my house. Before they came in and cut the land, we had trees behind us, but now we have nothing. We have no trees behind our property now. And I have no problem with that. The softball field will be right behind my house. As far as doing that, I would just like some means of buffering it, and I don't have enough room to buffer it behind my fence, and I prefer not to put fences inside. So I would like to see something, put in there to buffer it a little bit as far as doing that. And then also, question I have too is after the last couple of rains, to make sure that there's proper drainage for that, because of that is the low spot and drains off of there, and that would be where the softball field would be, where they would have proper drainage because of the way the water drains there.
Thank you, Mr. Sissel. Any questions for Mr. Sissel? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to speak for or against this application? All right, if not, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussion.
If we talk about buffering on these northern lots which are currently developed, do we not, what are y'all thoughts on the undeveloped lots of the future to the west? I mean, if we require a buffer on the north, I know there's a tree line already there, but I guess I'm just wondering if we start addressing buffering, do we not address this whole boundary on those issues? Or
I mean, at first glance, when we rode out there, assuming that there's no more going to be taken away from this west side, I don't know if the word is adequate or not. It didn't look as bad, let's put it that way,
right, I agree,
as the northern property line. And I guess Mr. Blomley could speak to his opinion with respect to that also, as well as other members that saw that line.
My thoughts were, though, if we do impose some sort of buffering, typically, let's say we're inclined to have a C buffer, I guess I'm curious as to, for uniformity's sake, or what the board's thoughts are on, should we include that around this residential border here, both north and to the west, or even though there's no houses there now, and of course they would get credit for whatever trees are already there. I guess I'm just wondering, if we impose a buffer just on these 4 or 5 lots, I don't know if that seems, I don't want to have an undue burden on the county, but at the same time, it would seem to be uniform for that neighborhood if we require it on these lots that are already there, to require it, to the west as well.
Mr. Sparkman ask that I bring to your attention that there's a note on the plans, supplement the existing trees along the western property line to ensure that there's no gap greater than 40 feet occurs in the tree line. Of course, no gap greater than 40 feet in the tree line doesn't equate to a buffer. It's more making sure that the perimeter planting requirements are met. I think our concerns as far as staff goes, we had, not to say that we're not concerned about the future residents in that next section of Huntington Place, but I guess we had greater concern with regard to the folks who had bought into that subdivision not knowing that this was going to be behind them. And of course, that always exists, as was the possibility that something more intense could have been requested back there. That's always the case, that people can make requests. But the folks that will build houses on those future lots will buy into it knowing what's going to be built behind them, whereas the folks that are there already did not have that expectation on those several lots. But it's certainly up to it's up to the board's discretion as to.
Yeah, I mean, I get that they didn't ask for this and it's come after they've bought their lot, but I guess the developer who owns those lots too probably didn't think he's going to have to be selling houses to folks that were going to buy with this unbuffered access to the school right behind them either. So, to some extent, I think it impacts, his investment as well, and not only future home buyers. Obviously, the home buyers, once a house is constructed, can buy or not buy based on what's there. I guess I would just, if I were the developer, I would feel like, if we require it on the north and not on the west, I would kind of have a little bit of a gripe, I think. But I get we brought this in on them, something they didn't ask for, and they bought it in one condition, and now we're changing it. So, I definitely get that argument.
Mr. Blomley, if you were going to make a recommendation of what, not that we have a definition of those buffers before us, what buffer you would be looking for, what would that be?
It's in my nearly 3 years advising the board, it's been, but the board's pretty consistently required type C buffers when an institutional group assembly use has abutted existing single-family residential.
I think that's the last one I remember was the church on Cason Lane, didn't we? Because there was a big gap in the back there.
Yes, there have been numerous churches that have come through, and I believe almost uniformly it's been type C buffers. I think that there may have been instances, as in the church on North Manny Avenue, where they didn't have the width for a type C buffer.
And we modified that one.
Yeah, but with fencing and number of plant materials, they were able to achieve type C buffer and everything but width of the planting yard. With regard to the gentleman's concerns about drainage, one thing that I can tell him, and this would be kind of my standard line, our engineering staff has worked with the applicants and is scrutinizing the grading and drainage plans and working to make sure that it will have no net negative impact on the surrounding property owners. And I know that the plans are still subject to final approval by the staff before permitting. As I mentioned, the Planning Commission has already scrutinized these plans, and they were made subject to the approval of the final approval of staff, as well as a special use permit being issued by the Board of Zoning Appeals.
And Matthew, just to clarify, and Mr. Dutton mentioned the increased traffic flow. No doubt he's right about that. But this road, unlike the previous application, this is a public road from the start, right? This is going to be a public road, so.
That's correct, and I think that Cushing was stubbed out right there for its extension one day, and I think
Right.
that the fact that it is a middle school use as opposed to a more single-family residential, might make it more of a destination for cut-through traffic. I think that's only inevitable, but at the same time, I think our expectations are that most of the school traffic will be coming from Dejohnette. The city did construct Dejohnette with uses like this in mind, reconstructed as a 5-lane cross-section just recently, as you all know. And this Cushing Avenue extension will be constructed as a 3-lane cross-section along the school property to accommodate for left turns into the site from Cushing.
All right, well, we have 3 items here in this application to deal with. First item I guess we need to deal with is the request for a 6-foot variance, is the request for a special use permit in order to construct an institutional group assembly use in a residential single-family RS-15 zone. So unless there's any further discussion, is there a motion on that one?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we approve the special use permit, subject staff comments, and I would like to add an additional requirement of a type C buffer along the north and west property lines to buffer the existing the existing homes as well as the future planned residential lots there to the north and west. That'd be my motion.
I'll second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion?
Could I get some clarification on that? Because those existing houses, or the proposed houses, don't go along the entire western property line. There is that, along the southern end of the property, there is one large single-family residential lot. Certainly that would be your option, whether or not to buffer it as well. But the northern half of the property along the western lot line is adjacent to those proposed lots in the next section of Huntington Place. And I'd just like some clarification on where that type C buffer, what's your...
My motion was along the north and west on these Huntington Place lots. It
Okay.
did not include the southernmost lot that's there. If I recall, there's quite a bit of space already on that buffer, and it's already between the other schools on the other side there. So
That's correct.
that would be my motion, just to buffer north and west Huntington Place lots.
And let me ask a question before we vote, if you don't mind. My understanding, and this may be beating it to death, but they're going to get credit for whatever's there with respects to, especially on the west side, correct?
That's correct. And what they will need to do is, as far as if the board makes that type C buffer a condition of approval, they would just need to work with Ms. Holloway in determining what all would be required in order to supplement that existing tree line in order to meet the definition of a type C buffer.
All right. Unless there's any further discussion, we're ready for a vote. All right, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that portion of the application has been granted. Move on to the request for the 6-foot variance of the 35-foot maximum permitted building height in an RS-15 zone. Do I have an motion on that one?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the 6-foot variance.
Second.
A motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, and lastly, the request for the 28-foot variance to the requirement that no parking shall be allowed in the required 40-foot front yard along the proposed Cushing Avenue extension. Do I have a motion on that one?
Move, we approve the 28-foot variance for parking in the front yard, subject to comments.
Mr. Blomley, I'm sorry. I've thought about this and just never asked the question. Is there any purpose for a dedicated pedestrian traffic walkway between the middle school and the high school, or is that just a moot point?
Like pedestrian access across Dejohnette Lane?
Yeah. Because right now, the kid, I just know this because my son goes to Oakland. In the mornings, there are kids, but there's a person directing traffic, I might add. There are kids that cross that are dropped off at Oakland, or the other way around, that are dropped off at John Pittard, and the elementary school kids will go to John Pittard, and then the high schoolers will walk across the street, and vice versa in the afternoon. Now, there's someone there that's directing traffic, stopping the traffic, and allowing those kids to cross that street, now a 5-lane street. I didn't know if, I think there's adequate parking at Oakland High School for any thing that's going on there, whether it be a basketball game or football game, because I've been to plenty and have not had to park off premises ever. I just didn't know if there would be any reason for the city to look at making a crosswalk between these two facilities at all.
I don't know that's been discussed between the applicant and staff. Of course, that would be since it would be on public right of way, that would be I believe a function of the city if that's what they were to do. What I'd be happy to do is relay your concern onto our traffic department and to our planning director and see if that's something that can be looked into.
Thank you.
All right, so on the request for 28-foot variance, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that application has been granted in its entirety. Mr. Sparkman, appreciate you coming in today. Ms. Hooper, appreciate you. Mr. Lee, thank you all for coming in today and presenting this to us. Thank you. We've got some plans here, if you all need these plans back. We have
Plans.
8 sets of plans here if you want them back.
Thank you.
I can't imagine that suggestion coming from a county commissioner. No, I don't know.
Thank you for catching.
I think, Chairman Rogers, were those that just so big and cumbersome, you were just trying to get them out of the way?
Right. I couldn't roll my chair around anywhere. All right, we'll move on then to application Z09033 by Ms. Jennifer Khalifa for Goodwill Industries of Middle Tennessee, requesting a special use permit in order to operate a temporary mobile recycling center in a commercial highway zone for property located at 3060 South Church Street. The applicant is also requesting an 8-foot variance to the requirement that no receptacle shall exceed 40 feet in length. And lastly, the applicant is requesting a 250-foot variance to the requirement that no receptacle shall be located closer than 300 feet from residentially zoned property. And Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that one, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Subject property is located at 3060 South Church Street. It's the location of the Food Lion Anchored Shopping Center. As you mentioned, I'll show you an aerial photograph here. This is the Food Lion Shopping Center, and this is the Barfield Commons condominium development, undeveloped commercial land directly to the south, and the Walgreens, of course, right there at the southwest corner of that intersection. The applicant's requesting a special use permit for a temporary mobile recycling center for Goodwill. And as you know, temporary mobile recycling centers require a special use permit, and there are also a set of standards that go along with the special use permit request, or with the special use permit requirements, and two of those standards the applicant is seeking a variance for today. But first, I'll go over with you the location. In your agenda materials, you'll note that the applicant outlined two options. Option number one being along the adjacent to the southern property line, and option number two being along this area here, which would be closer to the Walgreens. Since she has made application, she has been told by the property owner that one of the tenants in the shopping center has decided not to endorse her option number two and only to endorse option number one. And as a result, the applicant is now only left with one option, and that is the first option, which would be here along the southern property line. One of the requirements for a temporary mobile recycling center is that it be a minimum of 300 feet from a residential zoning district. As you can see, I've drawn the approximate location of the zoning boundary, while the property due south of where the proposed recycling trailer would be located is Commercial Highway. The property to the southwest is zoned RM16 and is the location of the Barfield Commons condominium development, as I mentioned before. Initially, staff in staff comments expressed a preference for option number two because sometimes the best type of buffer is just purely separation, and that was going to require about a 100-foot variance from that 300-foot separation requirement. Based on my measurements, the location of the proposed trailer will be approximately 50 feet away from that RM16 zoning district, requiring 250-foot variance to that 300-foot separation requirement. And the applicant is also seeking a variance on the size of the trailer. You'll recall at her other two locations, at the Murfreesboro Athletic Club on Memorial Boulevard, as well as at the Lowe's on Old Fort Parkway, she has been approved for special use permits at those two locations, as well as a variance to the length of the receptacle itself. The applicant meets all other standards, and one thing that staff did want to express is that the applicant does a good job of keeping the sites neat and tidy, which we appreciate. Here is a photograph submitted by the applicant of the type of trailer that they use, and this is the 48-foot trailer. 40 feet is the maximum length, and the 48 feet is the same size that they have at the other two locations that they've been approved for. This is looking into the site, looking westward. Option number two was to be located in this area over here, but option number two is no longer on the table. So this is looking southward towards Barfield Commons. Here are the condominiums, residential condominiums. This is looking south towards the area where the trailer would actually be located on these parking spaces here. And this is looking from the location of the trailer towards the back of those units. If the special use permit is approved, staff recommends the following conditions. The semi-trailer shall not be located within a driveway aisle. And number two, all parts of the semi-trailer shall comply with the minimum 42-foot front setback of the CH zoning district. Each of the three requests will need to be taken in separate motions. And Ms. Khalifa is in attendance to answer any questions that the board may have, either before or after the public hearing, and I'll be here as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, Ms. Khalifa, anything you'd like to add? At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further motions, any further discussion or motion. And I guess we need to take these, that we have 3 separate issues here as well. We've really broken these up today. We'll take the first one, special use permit in order to operate a temporary mobile recycling center in a commercial highway zone.
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of special use permit.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Any further discussion?
Is that subject to staff
I'm
comments?
sorry, subject to comments, staff.
Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we'll move next to the request for an 8-foot variance to the requirement that no receptacle shall exceed 40 feet in length.
I'll make a motion that we approve the 8-foot variance subject to staff comments.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, and lastly, the request for a 250-foot variance to the requirement that no receptacle shall be located closer than 300 feet from residentially zoned property.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the 250-foot variance with the staff recommendations.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Ms. Khalifa, that application has been granted. Thank you very much. All right, thank you. Good to see you. All right, next application is Z09034 by Ms. Julie Smith for Absolute Fireworks, requesting a special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment, a seasonal fireworks retailer, in a commercial highway zone for property located at 131 Cason Lane. And the applicant is also requesting a 6% variance to the requirement that the parking spaces displaced by a temporary vendor on the site of an existing permanent business will not total more than 25% of the total of parking available on site. And Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that for me, please.
I'm trying to make it as hard for you as possible, Chairman Rogers.
You're just doing an excellent job with that.
Thank you. The subject property, as you mentioned, is located at 131 Cason Lane. It's the site of an existing Duds and Suds laundromat as well as a tanning salon. This site has been approved for several years in the past. This will actually be its 4th year that they've been requesting approval for a seasonal fireworks retailer on site. The applicant is actually seeking both approval for the July 4th and New Year's selling season. The applicant had been approved prior to our latest regulations going into effect with regards to seasonal fireworks retailers, which stated that a seasonal fireworks retailer and all of its tent, its parking for customers, employees, et cetera, cannot displace more than 25% of the total parking on site. The applicant has presented to us how much parking she actually takes up with her operation, and it actually totals about 31% of the total parking on site. And this is actually, during peak hours of operation, which are somewhat limited during fireworks season. As has been told to me by multiple vendors, the days leading up to July 4th, the first 4 or 5 days of the selling season are generally pretty slow. It's that day or two leading up to July 4th where it starts to get really busy. At any rate, the applicant, after the latest regulations were passed last year, applied for a variance to that requirement and was granted that variance in addition to her special use permit. Staff is not aware of any complaints regarding the site's operation from previous years, including any need for additional parking. As you can see, they've actually submitted a letter from Pinnacle Bank next door stating that Pinnacle is giving them the use of their parking lot for employee parking to help spread out some of the needed parking for the site. In addition, the applicant has stated that typically on July 4th, which is the busiest day for fireworks sales, the tanning salon usually closes early. The applicant is proposing a 30 by 45 tent, which is the size tent that she has had in previous years. See, the location of the tent is actually on the south side of the property, 30 by 45. It will meet the proposed setback, or the 42-foot front setback. It meets all other separation requirements, and the applicant proposes to install a temporary power pole to provide electricity to the tent. The hours of operation will be from 10 a.m. until 10 p.m., with the exception of July 4th, July 5th, and December 31st, during which time the tent will be open until midnight. If the board approves the special use permit request, staff recommends the following conditions. Certification should be submitted that the tent is flame resistant or treated to be flame resistant. A fire extinguisher should be kept on site. The city's fireworks ordinance should be posted on site. No fireworks are to be set off on site. All signage is to comply with the city sign ordinance. The site must pass an electrical safety inspection prior to opening for business. An electrical permit must be purchased from the Building and Codes Department in order to obtain this inspection. And number 7, the tent must meet all minimum building setback requirements for the CH zoning district, and a tent permit must be obtained for the tent. I'm sure all of you all know those conditions by heart by now. At any rate, I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing. Ms. Julie Smith is present if you have any questions for her as well. And both the variance and the special use permit request will need to be taken in separate motions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, thank you. Mr. Smith, anything you'd like to add? At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or a motion. And again, we will take these separately, first considering the special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment.
Chairman, I move approval of the special use permit,
Second.
subject to staff comment.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, next we will address the request for a 6% variance to the requirement that the parking spaces displaced by a temporary vendor not exceed 25%.
Make a motion we approve the 6% variance, subject to staff comments.
Second?
All right, I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Ms. Smith, that application has been granted. Thank you very much. I think you've got a few more down here, don't you? Okay. All right.
Mr. Chairman,
yes,
might we take about a 5-minute break?
glad to. All right, we'll be in recess then for 5 minutes. All right, we'll back in session here. We'll continue on under special use permits with application Z09035 by Mr. Ismail Hassan for Uncle Sandy's, requesting a special use permit in order to operate a fireworks retailer in a light industrial zone for property located at 2019 South Church Street. And Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Subject property, as you mentioned, is at 2019 South Church Street. It's the Uncle Sandy's BP, and I'll show you right now on the overhead, the aerial photograph, excuse me. Here's the existing gas station building here, and they've got pumps both in the front and to the north side of the building. And it's bordered on the north side by Public Drive and on the south side by MyTech Drive, and of course on the west side by South Church Street. Subject property, I do a little research on the subject property. Mr. Hassan had communicated with our department a year or two ago about making application to the board for a special use permit to sell fireworks. Fireworks have been sold at this location for a number of years, but the state license lapsed at the end of 2006. After consulting with Mr. Ives, after Mr. Hassan initially called us, we determined that his grandfathered status under the previous regulations for fireworks retailers was no longer in place, and thus that he had to apply to the Board of Zoning Appeals for a special use permit. The requirement for a special use permit for fireworks retailers was not required until 1995, when the current regulations were adopted with regards to fireworks retailers in our zoning ordinance. Prior to that, I'm not sure of the exact process, but I believe that the Planning Commission actually handled fireworks requests and not the Board of Zoning Appeals. In 1995, that responsibility was transferred over to the Board of Zoning Appeals with a zoning ordinance amendment. According to my research, the building was built in 1984 by Mr. Roger Lloyd, and he owned it for approximately 12 years and sold fireworks from the time it was built until he sold the property to Mr. Robert Agee in 1996. Mr. Agee operated the gas station for a number of years and sold fireworks, and then Mr. Agee still owns the property and has given Mr. Hassan written permission to make application to sell fireworks there again, to make this special use permit application. But Mr. Ismail Hassan actually owns the business at Uncle Sandy's right now. And as I mentioned, he ceased selling fireworks in 2006, lost his lawfully established nonconforming status, and thus is now required to go before the Board of Zoning Appeals, actually for the first time, for a special use permit. So that's a little bit of history with regards to the property. And I know one thing that we're more used to seeing than this permanent type fireworks retailer is the seasonal fireworks retailers, the tents, in other words. I believe the last time the board saw a request for a permanent fireworks retailer was in 2005. So this is not something that we see a great deal of, so I'll kind of refresh your memory with regards to the standards, and of course I've included a set of those standards in your materials for your reference. Any site requested for approval for a fireworks retailer must be improved with a permanent structure from which the retail sales will be conducted. Number 2, fireworks retailers must be located to orient their trade to out-of-state tourists. For this purpose, the BZA shall consider the proximity of the site to interstate highway interchanges and the flow of out-of-state tourist traffic. Of course, the property is due north. We can see the aerial photograph. Of course, the service road back running along the interstate interchange is just to the south of the subject property, and the interchange as well as to the south of the subject property. Number 3, fireworks retailers must comply with the following codes: Standard Building Code, Standard Fire Prevention Code, and Murfreesboro City Code, Section 12, Article 2, Pyrotechnics. And the applicant shall demonstrate the ability to comply with these codes by obtaining a letter so stating from the Building and Codes Department. And you'll see a letter from Mr. Gary Whitaker, our Building and Codes Director, with regards to standard number 3. Inspections have been conducted, and Mr. Whitaker has written a letter of codes compliance. This letter also included inspection by our fire department. Mr. Carl Pease is here today. Ms. Nora Smith actually conducted the inspection, but Mr. Carl Pease is here today representing Ms. Smith and the fire department with regards to that inspection. And Mr. Whitaker is here today also if you have any questions for him with regards to his letter that's been included in your packages. Fireworks retailers must comply with all state laws regarding the sale of fireworks. Number 5, any fireworks stored on the site of a fireworks retailer must be located a minimum of 50 feet from any fuel source and no further than 500 feet from an operable fire hydrant. What I'd like to do is show you an enlarged version of the site. There's a fire hydrant just to the south of the subject property, well within 500 feet. And I have measured from the distance from the nearest fuel pumps, both in front of the store, and I was actually pointing the wrong way for the fire hydrant. The fire hydrant's down here along MyTech Drive. I've actually measured from the fuel pumps to inside the store. The building itself is not 50 feet away from the fuel pumps. However, there are locations inside the store that will comply with that minimum 50-foot separation requirement. And what I've done in my staff comments is that if the board does approve this application, we recommend the following condition. No fireworks shall be stored closer to any fuel source than 50 feet, and the planning staff must approve the layout of the fireworks sales area, verifying that it meets the 50-foot separation requirement prior to the applicant being allowed to begin stocking and selling fireworks. And finally, the sixth standard in our zoning ordinance is that the BZA may require additional standards be met in order to assure compatibility of the proposed location with the adjoining properties. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions. And as I mentioned before, Mr. Whitaker from our Building and Codes Department and Mr. Pease from our Fire Department are both here if you have any questions for them with regards to their inspection or Mr. Whitaker's letter. Other than that, we need to conduct a public hearing with regards to this request.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Mr. Whitaker, anything you would like to add to the application? There you are. Okay. You all have Mr. Pease. Anything you'd like to add?
No, at this time.
You guys have sat patiently through these applications here, and it's your opportunity to get up here. All right. Then at this time,
I have a question for Mr. Whitaker or Mr. Pease, either one. Does a permanent location, once they reapply, does it have to be sprinklered?
It depends. There's a section in the code that actually allows you to have a certain amount of retail class fireworks. Here again, we're talking about retail class, not commercial type, but it will allow you to have up to, I think it's 125 cubic feet of area of fireworks that in a building that's unsprinkled. If you go over that amount, then you would have to have a sprinkler system. This building does have a sprinkler system, by the way.
It does?
It is.
Okay.
It's fully sprinkled.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
all right, did you say Mr. Hassan is here, the applicant? Somebody on behalf of the
Yes,
applicant?
yes,
All right. Mr. Hassan, is there anything you'd like to add to this application, sir? Okay. Then at this time, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. Mr. Fly has waited patiently as well.
I've learned a lot. Mainly that I'll now be able to walk to school. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the Board of Zoning Appeals today on this request for a special use permit. My name is Frank Fly. I live at 3600 Manchester Pike, and my office is at 302 North Spring Street here in Murfreesboro. I'm here representing Mike Ingram, who's the president of Fireworks Over America, based in Maryland, or Springfield. His office is actually in Springfield, Missouri. And we have some concerns about this particular application. And it is a fairly complex situation, complex application. It doesn't fit the mold, so to speak. The rules and regulations and laws regarding the retail sale of fireworks and fireworks materials are very detailed and comprise not only the city but also state laws and regulations. Mr. Whitaker referred, I think, to one of the concerns regarding the amount of fireworks to be on the premises. Mr. Blomley referred to another concern regarding the distance from the gas pumps. We'll take that up first. I went out there yesterday as well and measured from the front gas pumps. The building is 25 feet. Now, what that means is, of course, with the 50-foot setback requirement, that no fireworks could be offered for sale or stored in the building in the first 25 feet after you get inside the building. So you've got to go 25 feet from the pumps to the front of the building, another 25 feet inside the building. Now, I have not been inside the entire building. Only a small portion of that building is open for and utilized for retail sales purposes. But the part that is open is not much more than 40 feet. So that would only leave about 15 feet that could be used for the storage of the fireworks, which brings us to the next issue, which is the sprinkler system. Now, the reason the sprinkler system is critical is because that determines what classification the facility falls under. Without a sprinkler system, there's a maximum of 500 pounds of firework material, including the packaging, that can be stored on the site at any given time. With a sprinkler system, the maximum is doubled to 1,000 pounds, including the packaging. I noticed in the application that the applicant says that the facility does have sprinklers, but there are no details about that. And like I say, I don't know what's in the back of the building. I only know what you see when you enter the door that comprises all of the retail area. But if there are no sprinkler systems, for example, in the warehouse part of it, we'll call it, since we don't know what the back part of the building is used for, it's partitioned off, it's closed off to the public. If there are no sprinkler systems back there, then we've got a problem, because there's not enough room in the present retail area to meet the 50-foot setback requirement and still fall within the standards. If there is no sprinkler system, then that limits us, as I said, to 500 pounds, which probably is not commercially feasible for the applicant, just to be truthful with you. If there is a sprinkler system in the back and they're going to knock out that wall and open up some of the warehouse and add that to the retail space, then both the front and the back, the present retail space and the warehouse space to be added to it, would have to be subject to the sprinklers. So I think the first thing we need to do is either answer these questions today or defer this matter until after there's been a more detailed investigation. Now, I'm no expert on these fireworks regulations, and I've had to immerse myself into them, and as part of that process, we hired a consulting engineer out of California who is rated as one of the top experts in the nation on fireworks zoning matters. His name is Rick Thornberry. He's a professional engineer for the Code Consortium, which does consulting work out of Napa, California. And through my client, we requested an opinion from Mr. Thornberry, and actually two, and I'd like to hand out copies of the first one, if I may. One for everybody. Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to read this aloud if the chairman prefers that, or simply allow time for everybody to read it to themselves.
Yeah, if it's all right with the board, I think we'll read it here as we can, and if we need to at the end, we haven't had an opportunity to read it. We'll carry on with your comments, and then if we have an opportunity to
Well, my
read it.
comments would be directed toward this first opinion letter. He expresses in paragraph 2 what the purpose of his review was and who requested it and why he's giving it. He tells what he has reviewed, and on in paragraph 3 on the first page, based on this information, he reviewed the staff comments and says that this would be classified as a Group M mercantile occupancy, which includes retail stores and motor fuel dispensing facilities. Goes on down to the last paragraph on page 1 that the request indicates the intent to sell consumer fireworks at retail, which is certainly what is sought here, and points out again that we're all in agreement this has not been done since 2006, and thus the facility lost its grandfather status as a non-conforming use. And it goes on to point out then, too, what Mr. Whitaker was referring to. I think Mr. Whitaker referred to it maybe as square feet, but actually I think the standard is in pounds. And it says, because the consumer fireworks are introduced into a building in quantities that exceed the maximum allowable quantity per controlled area in accordance with Table 307.11 of the 2006 International Building Code, the occupancy classification changes to a Group H3 high hazard occupancy. Now, see, this is the question that we don't have the answer to at this moment. And like I say, don't know if we can get that answer today or not, because we don't know, and maybe the fire marshal the fire department representative who did the inspection is not here, and I don't know if the representative from the fire department can tell us whether the entire building has a sprinkler system or just the front retail area. If that's a proper question for the chairman, I'll pose that question. The next full paragraph on page 2 that says this assumes that the maximum allowable quantity per control area for consumer fireworks is exceeded within the building. That is, that they're going to stock more than 500 pounds, and it explains that here too in the middle. It can be assumed that 25% of the gross weight of the fireworks, including packaging, can be used to calculate the pyrotechnic composition, which is the limit is without a sprinkler 125 pounds net weight of pyrotechnic composition. Now, based on my vast experience as a 7th grade language arts teacher before I went to law school, I think pyrotechnic composition means the content that actually gives you the pop. But since that's hard to weigh, if you weigh everything, including the packaging, at 25%, then it gives a maximum of 500 pounds there in the middle of that paragraph. And if you read on down, thus if the building is sprinklered, a maximum allowable quantity of 250 pounds of net pyrotechnic content or 1,000 pounds of gross weight of the fireworks, including packaging, would be allowed without changing the occupancy classification to a Group H3. Now, certainly at the present time, this building does not meet the requirements of a Group H3 occupancy structure. So we've got to determine before we vote today, I think, on whether or not the sprinkler system includes the entire building, and if so, where they're going to put the fireworks and what would be the gross weight of the total gross weight of the fireworks, including packaging, is going to be and where it's going to be in the building. The pumps also on the left-hand side of the building, as you face it from the street, are within 50 feet of the building too. So that's got to be taken into consideration. What you're doing is moving toward the back from the front entrance and to the right from the left side entrance and painting yourself into a corner, so to speak, of where you can put these fireworks for sale. And So if the system is sprinklered, and if they meet the 50-foot requirement in all directions in the sprinklered area, then I think they would probably be in compliance and may be entitled to their special use permit. But I don't know that we have enough information today to answer that question. The two or three other things I'll point out on this opinion. The bottom of page 2, the last paragraph, says the 2006 International Fire Code applies to both new and existing buildings. Now, this is part of the discussion Mr. Whitaker and I had earlier in the week about the difference between an application for a special use permit from an existing building as opposed to a new building. Certainly a new building would have to meet the 2006 International Building Code in all respects and the 2006 International Fire Code in all respects. Now, the question of whether or not those same codes would apply to an existing building, the answer is yes. And I'll address that further in a minute in a second opinion letter I'm going to pass out from Mr. Thornberry. But this points out, too, because he gave me a second letter because I wanted to clear up in my own mind exactly how that fit together. But he says here in the first letter that it does apply to both new and existing buildings. And if the change of use or occupancy requires a change, Section 102.3, change of use or occupancy, requires a change in use or occupancy to comply with the new occupancy requirements of both the IFC and the IBC. This section also has the same approval allowance as given to the building official by IBC Section 3406.1, where the proposed use is less hazardous. That doesn't apply. What that says is that you can go down, but you can't go up in your hazardous material use. And so then at the top of page 3, probably the most restrictive requirement that must be met in the IBC for Group H3 occupancy is that the building be protected throughout with a complete automatic sprinkle system. Now, that's what we don't know here. As required by Section 903.2.4, Group H, since all Group H occupancies are required to be protected with an automatic sprinkler system regardless of their size. Then certainly in the third paragraph, I guess, on page 3, middle of that paragraph, that certainly may be the case for the existing building, but would not be applicable for the proposed change in use. As noted in the letter from the Building and Codes Department, the International Property Maintenance Code simply governs minimum property requirements and standards in evaluating the condition of the property. Thus, it is not intended to assess a change in use or occupancy of the building. And Mr. Whitaker and I had a discussion, and I guess Mr. Blomley and I did too, briefly, talked about whether or not the proper codes were used to generate the letter of approval from Building and Codes that Mr. Whitaker submitted, because he had indicated that he used the International Property Maintenance Code rather than the International Building Code. And I wondered why that would be, because if we look at the city code, and I have a copy of it here if anyone would like to see it, but under the section entitled Procedure for Uses Requiring Special Permits, and then at the bottom of page 61, Section Y, fireworks retailers shall be subject to the following additional standards. And we learned in law that the word shall means must. And then you turn to page 62, and it has to be a permanent structure, number one, has to be oriented to out-of-state tourists. I'm not sure what the logic behind that is, but I've always wondered why those big signs were down there on the way to Chattanooga on the interstate, and now I know. And Section 3, fireworks retailers must comply with the following codes. And they use the word must there, not the word shall. So there's no misunderstanding of what is required. They must comply with Section A, the Standard Building Code. Well, that's been supplanted, as we all know now, by the International Building Code. So your own regulations say that the code to be applied is not the International Property Maintenance Code, but is the standard building code, or now the International Building Code. And Mr. Whitaker did not use the International Building Code. He used the International Property Maintenance Code. Now, he's the expert, not me. And so the code that he used may very well be appropriate if the 50-foot setback rule is honored in both directions, and if the poundage limit is met. And that being 500 pounds gross product weight, including packaging, for the areas that are not sprinklered, and 1,000 pounds including if all the areas are sprinklered. And we don't yet know whether both the front and the back parts of the building are sprinklered or not, and if the wall is going to be knocked out, or what the plan is. And that's our main concern. Mr. Thornberry goes on to say in the next to the last paragraph, therefore, based on the analysis made above, it is my opinion as a registered professional fire protection engineer that the existing building needs to be inspected for conformance to the 2006 IBC and the 2006 IFC as a Group 3 occupancy on the basis that the maximum allowable quantity of consumer fireworks in 1.4G will be exceeded. That is the 500 pounds without a sprinkler and the 1,000 pounds with a sprinkler when the fireworks are brought into the building for retail sales. Now, I did ask him for a follow-up to that, and he did expound upon it a little further. If I can pass these copies out, please. He followed up with a second letter that I received this morning. This letter is much shorter. It says, Dear Mr. Ingram, that's my client, as requested, I have reviewed the 2006 International Property Maintenance Code to determine its applicability to the above referenced building in light of the building undergoing a change in use and occupancy as discussed in my previous email dated May 28. Section 101.3, intent of the 2006 IPMC states that it applies to the continued occupancy and maintenance of existing structures and premises. It is focused on maintaining existing structures and premises to ensure public health, safety, and welfare. And that's the same thing Mr. Whitaker told me yesterday. However, Section 102.3, application of other codes, requires that changes of occupancy shall be done in accordance with the procedure and provisions of the International Building Code. And here we do have a change in occupancy and use of the building. The previous use for fireworks was abandoned in 2006. After being abandoned for more than 365 days, they lost their right to be grandfathered, and therefore this is a new use. And so that is why we're in the situation that we're in, and we simply, at this point, either need to deny the application or to defer it and to get additional information. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fly. Any questions for Mr. Fly? Mr. Fly, let me make sure I understand then what, essentially there's three concerns that you've pointed out. First of all, having to do with the sprinkler system, what the extent of the sprinkler system is. Second point is how much is in the way of poundage is going into the store. And the third point is this a property that should have been inspected according to the International Building Code as opposed to the International Property Management Code?
I think that's right. And they're dovetailed a little bit because the poundage may determine which code is appropriate.
Right.
And Mr. Whitaker could correct me if I'm wrong about that, but that's the way I understand it.
Okay.
And I think, too, that at the very least, the poundage requirement, although it is written into the law, should be also written in as a condition to the special use permit if that is the opinion of the board that the permit might otherwise be subject to approval. The 50-foot requirement is also in the law, but Mr. Plumlee's recommended that it be included as a condition. I think it would be also appropriate to include the poundage as a requirement.
Okay.
What's going to be the difference in an inspection under the IPMC and the IBC? In other words, is the difference this poundage requirement and the sprinklers, is that going to be the distinction?
No. Once you move into that Group H3 high hazard occupancy classification
Under the IBC?
Right. That puts you into the IBC, and the standards are much more strict in every way. And in fact, it would be the same standards that would be required of a new building.
So is it your assertion that this property wouldn't pass an IBC inspection where it has the other inspection? Or do you know the answer to that?
I haven't inspected it and wouldn't be qualified to inspect it, but I think Mr. Whitaker indicated to me earlier in the week that it would not pass that. I think the maintenance code only addresses life safety issues and doesn't address all the other requirements that are presently in place for new buildings. So to answer your question more directly, the answer would be no, I don't think it would pass.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fly.
Yes.
What I'd like to do is go ahead and get any further public comments and then come back to Mr. Whitaker and have him address the issues that have been raised here, and the applicant as well. All right, are there any other comments? Okay. Then I'll call on, I guess, Mr. Whitaker, if you want to address the issues that have been raised, and then Mr. Hassan will get you next and have you address those as well.
Frank has raised a lot of questions. We have looked at that building. He is correct. His engineer is correct. We looked at the building under the International Property Maintenance Code. Let me back up and start. I'll try to address all of his questions and issues, a few of which I can't, the three things that he had brought up. One, the owner would have to address the amount, the quantity. I do believe it is under 1,000 pounds gross weight. That's a large amount of fireworks to have in a building. The other item that you may want to hear from is the fire department, as far as it, from my understanding, is a fully sprinkled building. It's not partially sprinkled. It does meet the requirements. It is a monitored system, so it complies with the requirements as a sprinkled building. Let me back up to the zoning code for just a moment. The section that he referred to when he said that the firework retailers must comply with the following code, he is correct. That's what it states. But items A and B state that the standard building code and the standard fire code. We no longer have the standard fire code, standard building code. Section of your zoning ordinance has not been updated since we adopted. We had three model code groups that were the BOCA, the SBCCI, and ICBO, and they actually went together and made which was a southern code, a northern, and a code that they used out west. Those three model code groups went together and created the International Code. That's what we have currently adopted. It's the 2006 International Code. I just happen to have a copy here today. That code, we typically use it on new buildings. For commercial buildings, there's one for residential buildings, and there's a mechanical section, there's a plumbing, there's even a model energy code, and a gas code. So we have the whole section adopted, and the fire codes are adopted as well. Now, when he talks about using this code, if you'll go back to the zoning code, it says the standard building code. It doesn't say that the firework retailer must comply with the entirety of the code. It doesn't say that it must comply with a specific section of the code. It just said must comply with code, with the codes. The reason we use the International Property Maintenance Code is that the International Property Maintenance Code is a maintenance code.
When we inspect under the International Property Maintenance Code, we look at the mechanical systems, we look at the electrical, we look at the building structure, we look at the building itself, we look at the maintenance of the building, whether it's painted or not. We look at a whole host of things. When a building is built new, from the ground up, or remodeled, or a change of occupancy, as he has stated, we would use the 2006 International Building Code. If Uncle Sandy's were to add an addition on today, for that addition, we would use this building code. If they were to change the occupancy, we would have to review it under the new standards in the building code. They're not changing, from my understanding, in my opinion, they're not changing the occupancy of this building to a hazardous occupancy. They are under, from what I understand, they are under the amount that's allowed. It is a fully sprinkled building. So therefore, we did consider the section in this book dealing with fireworks, which is a very small section, and it states, just as his fire protection engineer did, once you get over a certain amount, then that would make the building classified as a hazardous occupancy. That's quite a large amount of fireworks to have in that building, though. It is fully sprinkled again. Again, I said we use the International Property Maintenance because our zoning code specifically doesn't tell me what section of this code to use. I think we're all in agreement with that. Also, to go back and inspect their building with full compliance of this book, I think would be unrealistic. To do that, we would have to go in, dig up the foundation, look at the block, see if they were laid with horizontal reinforcement, look at the structural elements of the ceiling. It doesn't tell us to go in and do a forensics investigation of that building. What it's asking us to do is go in, because what are we doing here? We're adding some fireworks, which are mercantile, as long as they're under these numbers. They're just adding a different type of commodity in here to sell. Granted B, if you get over those numbers, then it would change. But we're still looking at it as a mercantile sales use building. We looked at the life safety elements of that building, the fire sprinkler system. We looked at the exiting. We look at exit lights. We look at the ingress, egress of the building, because that's what we're supposed to do. We're to make sure that this building is safe for the public to come into, and that they don't exceed. I do not believe it would be at all out of to come in and ask to make a stipulation for this zoning request to limit him per the code on the amount of fireworks that he can store in here. To me, that's a reasonable request to come in and ask for and to put on his special use permit. The Building Codes Department does not go out and make inspections. Once a building is, the certificate of occupancy has been issued on a building, we don't go out and make yearly inspections. The fire department does that. In fact, once we issue a certificate of occupancy, unless they're changing the use or adding on to a building, we don't go back in them and don't have the right to. When they come and want to change the use, the occupancy, or add on or remodel, then we issue permits, and then we go back into the buildings and make inspections. The fire department makes annual inspections, and they do look. They go in, they check for emergency lights, exit lights, and if it's a stipulation that's put on there, I'm sure between the zoning and between the fire department, they would regulate to see if, in fact, that they are keeping the amounts that they're supposed to or that you would approve. The one thing I would like to point out is in the engineered letter, or the letter that was presented to us, and it'd be nice to have a little bit more time to look over this, but in the amount of time that I did have to look, he stated in here specifically that it would not change the occupancy if the building was sprinkled and they didn't exceed 1,000 pounds gross weight of fireworks, that it wouldn't change the occupancy of the building. Unless they exceed that, if this letter is correct, unless they exceed that, then they can go up to 1,000 pounds of gross weight of firework material without changing the use of that building. Therefore, there would be no need for me to look in the 2006 International Code. I would have used the property maintenance. And one thing I'd like to add is the fire code has the identical information that they inspected under regarding fireworks, the sales of fireworks, that this 2006 International Building Code has. Verbatim, word for word, it has the same information. So even though I may not have used it when we made our inspection, the fire department did. So I feel that we have covered the bases. I feel that it's not a change of use, and therefore that's why we issued the letter stating that the building was in compliance and that it was okay as well, I believe, and I don't want to speak for the fire department, But I did talk to Nora when she made that inspection. That's why I included that line in our letter that states that the fire department was okay with it as well. I hope I've answered all the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. Any questions for Mr. Whitaker?
So, Mr. Whitaker, as I understand it, your position is that the definition of change in use or occupancy is provided with this poundage requirement in the IBC that says if it goes over the poundage, it then becomes an H3 and classifies it differently and would change the use, but otherwise that doesn't. If it's below that, then we haven't changed our use.
That is correct, and that is actually reiterated in the letter from the fire protection engineer. That is correct. And that is in, as I just stated, that is in the International Building Code as well as the Fire Code, both. That same information.
And am I correct in understanding that if we don't go over the poundage and don't change the occupancy, then we don't review it under the IBC? We review under the Property Maintenance Code as acceptable?
In my opinion, it is. Here again, like I said, the zoning code is actually referencing the old standard building code, which has not been in existence since 2000, was the last time they produced that. We have since adopted the 2006 codes, which are not the standard building code. And again, if you'll read in here, it doesn't state in here what part of this, what sections of the code you use, whether it's all of it or a portion of it. Naturally, again, as I reiterated, I think it would be unrealistic to assume that that building had to comply with everything in this book. If that's the case, the only buildings that would comply would be a building that was permitted today, inspected today, and have a certificate today. I think that's unrealistic, and I don't think that was the intent of this, and David Ives may answer that or have a better opinion of that than myself, but I don't think that's the intent. The intent of this was to ensure safety for the public, and we have done that, and we feel like that it does comply.
Very good. All right, any other questions?
I don't know if it's a question for you or the fireman, but did you say that they make periodic checks?
The fire department actually does routine inspections in all buildings, or they try to, and that's something that we'd probably want to talk to Mr. Pease about, but every year they go out and inspect all buildings. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Whitaker. Mr. Pease, is there anything, in light of the comments that have been said, anything that you'd like to add at this point?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, the only thing I can add is that there was an inspection conducted on May 11th of this year. The building is fully sprinkled. Ms. Nora Smith, my partner, actually did the inspection. And in the inspection, the building originally was not even, when the building was originally built, was not even required to be sprinkled. Evidently, the owners brought it upon themselves to go ahead and sprinkle the building. At the time, the sprinkler system was not required to be a monitored sprinkler system. If a building is occupied 365 days a year, open 24 hours, they are not required to be monitored by an outside agency to monitor that sprinkler system. This applicant has actually went that step further and has a monitoring company monitoring his system, even though he's not required to have that. So it is a sprinkle building, and it is monitored by an outside agency. But yes, ma'am, to answer the question further, we try to do annual inspections yearly. We do inspections on, if we get complaints, our inspectors are in the field daily. Now, to say we get in every building every year, that might be stretching it, and Murfreesboro's growing. So there's a lot of businesses out there, but we try to get into them annually.
All right, any other questions for Mr. Pease? All right, thank you. All right, Mr. Hassan, anything you would like to add now?
Good afternoon. Ishmael Hassan with Uncle Sandy's. I'm just going to add that I have been working on the store for the past year as far as hiring electricians, had him make it where it's safe in the store, done upgrade everything in the store, painted the store, and like he added a monitoring system too for the sprinkler system. And yes, my store is all sprinkled all the way in the back and in the front too. And that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Hang on one second. I bet you're going to get questions. Any questions for Mr. Hassan?
And this may be for Mr. Hassan and Mr. Blomley. I mean, the code, or not the code, but the zoning ordinance that we're dealing with dictates this 50-foot setback from these gas pumps. And I haven't been inside this building, so is there going to be it sounds like that there must be going to be a designated area for this fireworks?
Yes.
That's going to be in the back right-hand corner if you're facing the building?
It will actually go in the middle. Mr. Matthew came in and took the measurement from the diesel island and also from the gas island, and we agreed on the area where it's going to go, the fireworks in there, and I got displayed that have been ordered where the fireworks is going to go, where it's going to be 50 foot from the gas pumps and 50 feet away from the diesel pumps too.
So right now, if you walked into your store, you wouldn't necessarily see the access to where these fireworks will be placed. Is that a correct statement?
No, actually, if you walk into the store, it's going to be probably, and as soon as you walk in, it depends on what door you're going in the store.
Yes, sir.
If you're going from the front door where the gas pumps is at, you'll be able to see them like probably about maybe 10 feet or something. They'll be displayed on there. And if you're coming from the other door, on the side door where the diesel line is at, no, you won't be able to see them.
Mr. Halliburton, when I went out and when I put out my sign for the property, I inspected for compliance with that requirement. And Mr. Fly's measurements are very near what my measurement were with regards to how close the gas pump is to the building itself. I measured about 25, 26 feet from the gas pumps that are in front of the store along South Church Street, and the diesel pumps that are to the north of the building, I measured about 32 feet. So what he's looking at, and when I was out there, I took my measuring wheel, went inside the door, and measured into the store to the point where that was 50 feet away from both the islands on the west side and the islands on the north side. And he will have to go in about 24, 25 feet from the front door, which would be facing South Church Street, and approximately 18 to 20 feet from the side door that's facing the north side, public drive, I believe. And we did determine that there was an area, currently as you come in, he's got, I believe it's his tobacco area, I believe, is that correct?
Yeah.
And
correct.
he told me that he's going to be doing some re-merchandising, reorganizing of the store if he's granted this special use permit. And we identified the area in the store, which actually in the back far right-hand corner, I believe, are the fountain drinks. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and so it would be from the back center of the store, and it would be from that side over to that back corner, which would be where the fountain drinks are. So that area would be the area where the only area in the store that would be that fireworks could be located in. Approximately, if I had to estimate, about probably a quarter to a third of the store meets that in the store area, not the warehouse, but a quarter to a third of the store meets that 50-foot separation requirement.
Mr. Hassan, what about the poundage? I mean, what do we know as far as how much you're going to put in there?
What I'm planning on, I'm not going to exceed where it will be a hazard. I'm planning on, like, through the year, just carrying the light stuff, like nothing heavy, just 4th of July, and not exceed 1,000 pounds. Just take over whatever the storage was doing before anyway,
And there's no plans on your part to expand that store beyond its current retail area, not going to add anything in the warehouse?
No. I never carry any extras anyway. It's just we carry what goes through, just 4th of July, and just have enough for that interstate traffic, just pretty much like sparklers or something like that. Nothing more through the year.
Okay. All right. Any other questions for Mr. Hassan? All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Let me see if there's anybody else that wishes to speak, and then come back to Mr. Fly. Anyone else present wishing to speak for or against this application? Okay. Mr. Fly, I'll give you another crack here, and then we'll close the public
Yeah,
hearing.
very briefly, I'd just like to say that if there are going to be inspections of the 50-foot limit periodically, once or twice a year or whatever, that we probably ought to inspect the poundage at the same time. It'd be a fairly simple matter to carry a scale in there and just load everything on and add it up and make sure that the applicant's in compliance.
Thank you, sir. All right, there being no other than comments, we'll go ahead and declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussion or motion.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't know what anybody else, it's one of those where we all kind of chime in and then we'll see where we are. It seems to me, based on what we've been presented, Mr. Whitaker's point, I think it comes down to whether or not this is a change in use or occupancy or not. And based on the opinion of Mr. Whitaker and, frankly, this letter, as he pointed out, from Mr. Ingram, seems to indicate that the change in occupancy would occur if we increased over this poundage, which would put it into this H3 category. It's an existing building. It's been there. There's no meeting of the definition of change in use or occupancy, so I think our codes department has addressed or inspected it under the correct code. So having said that, it seems to me that it would be something that meets the requirements, and that with an additional requirement to have the applicant remain under the 1,000 pounds gross weight, including packaging, I think he's probably met the standard, at least in my opinion. I'm interested to see what anybody else would think.
And the only question that I have is, and I asked the question, we're clear that this is where the product is stored versus the building itself, is the way this thing reads today.
Yes, sir. The way that it's actually worded in the zoning ordinance, it says that any fireworks stored on the site of a fireworks retailer must be located a minimum of 50 feet from any fuel source. And we've always interpreted fuel source to mean the location of a gas pump, and no further than 500 feet from an operable fire hydrant. I admittedly had that same question when the application came in, and got an interpretation from Mr. Ives as well as an opinion from Mr. Ken Honeycutt, our fire marshal, and they both agreed to read it as it's stated, that it's where the fireworks are actually stored, not the location of the building.
I just didn't know if we should add a condition, or if that's even necessary, that it should be under that 1,000 pounds and it should be checked when they, check the building.
Can we place a condition that would that be in the vein of, if we get a complaint, then we might have to send somebody out there to check on it? But, can the board place an affirmative duty on the city to go out and actually weigh this? You understand my question?
I'm not sure that it can be placed quite that way. Certainly the board can place a condition on the special use permit that the operator not exceed the 1,000-pound limit, with a suggestion or a request even that the appropriate inspecting departments verify that from time to time. Not sure that this board would really have the authority to direct that be inspected on any particular occasion.
I would think it might come, and of course Mr. Whitaker might be able to better answer this, but it would be in the light of any other kind of code violation. If you get a notice or somebody calls the city and says, hey, they've got M80s out there by the truckload, then the city might need to go out there and verify the poundage, verify they're in compliance. But
And I think any time a complaint like that would come in, that either the codes or the fire department or perhaps police even would be responding to that to verify the status of the property, and be very appropriately so, because if there was certainly anything grossly in excess of this limitation, then a serious hazard is being created.
Impact exists, yeah.
And that's typically what would happen with any zoning violation, any complaint that we would get. We would respond to, if someone called in, for example, and said, it appears that they are exceeding what they were approved for, then we would respond to that complaint and visit the site. I think that that my recommended condition was more of an initial type inspection to make sure that before he began selling, that his setup met that 50-foot requirement. Now, certainly that's not to say that if we got a complaint that it was not meeting that requirement, that I wouldn't go out there and verify that. But the intent of my recommended condition was to, before he is allowed to begin selling fireworks, that he must show me his setup so that I can verify that distance requirement.
I think that to some extent the 1,000-pound maximum would be automatic, because if he goes over that, then he is in fact changing the use and occupancy of his building that he does not have a certificate of occupancy to do. It would be as if he set up a bar and began serving mixed drinks and sandwiches at the back without going through the appropriate changes. So I don't think it would be inappropriate for this board to make that as an affirmative condition, but I think that at least to a large extent it's automatically there under this, the occupancy that he now has, which is the mercantile occupancy.
Chairman, if I may, if you were considering putting stipulations on the permit, I would request, due to the fact that we're using that 1,000-pound number, but I have not had time to actually look in the code and see, to verify that, what I would recommend you to do is actually put a stipulation that for him not to exceed the allowable quantities in the International Fire Code and International Building Code. And then, again, if he did, if we got a complaint, the fire department would go out and look at that and look at the table and see that they do not exceed that. And if they do, then we can, we have several options at that point. We can cite them to city court. We can have them to remove it because it would change their occupancy, which would actually bring in building code regulations at that time. But I'd recommend not using this 1,000-pound number because I'm not sure if that is in fact correct or not, but reference the allowable quantities in the standard or the International Fire Code and International Building Code.
We could revoke their permit too.
Absolutely.
Yes. That's a very good point. And the other aspect is if the 2007 fire and building codes are adopted next year, that poundage, assuming it is 1,000 pounds today, it may change. And whether it might go up and it might go down, and it seems to me that requirement should float with the classification that the codes, that the building code has this placed in.
As amended, then, you would recommend that we say as amended.
Right.
With regard to that.
And just to reiterate one more thing that you said, Mr. Dodd, is that if the zoning ordinance does give us the power, if someone is found to, for example, be chronically in violation of a special use permit issued by the Board of Zoning Appeals, if that were the case, then it could be brought back up to the board for revocation of that special use permit, in addition to other remedies such as citation to city court for violation of the special use permit.
Okay, well, let's keep moving here. Let's go ahead and get a motion on the floor, and then we can continue any discussion that we need.
Oh, go ahead. I thought you already made a motion.
No, I don't. I just kind of told you what I'll move that we approve the special use permit subject to existing staff comments, and I'll try to craft this adequately with the additional requirement that the applicant comply with the IBC International Building Code and IFC, International Fire Code, as that code might be amended with regard to the maximum poundage that can be stored on site to remain as a mercantile use and not go over what would be placed into high-risk use, H3 use. I don't know if that's artful enough, but
Second.
stab at it.
I second the motion.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Now, any further discussion? All right, if not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, to Mr. Hassan, that application has been granted. Appreciate you and Mr. Pease, Mr. Whitaker, Mr. Fly, you all being here today and presenting that information to us. Thanks very much. Okay, we'll move on to application Z09036 by Mr. Michael Ingram for Wet Willie's Fireworks Supermarket of Tennessee, requesting a special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment, a seasonal fireworks retailer, in a light industrial zone for property located at 2030 South Church Street. And Mr. Blomley, if you would review that application for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Subject property, as you mentioned, is located at 2030 South Church Street. It is the site of the former location of the fireworks supermarket, which, as you all are aware, burned last October, I believe, and is no longer on site. You see the aerial photograph of the site. Of course, this was taken in 2007. Here's the old building that was previously there, in the parking lot in front of it. This is the Exxon on the Run just to the north, and the Knights Inn is to the west and to the south of the subject property. Of course, the Uncle Sandy's application that we just reviewed a few minutes ago is to the northeast of the subject property across South Church Street. The applicant is requesting a special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment, seasonal fireworks retailer. And of course, in the past, this site has been the home of a permanent fireworks retailer, and this would be for a seasonal fireworks retailer for both the July 4th and the New Year selling season. The applicant has complied with the orders of the demolition permit on site, and the site is now compliant after having been obviously ravaged by fire. And now he is able to make application for the seasonal fireworks retailer. As you can see here, here's kind of a close-up of the property itself. This was the original drawing that was submitted to the Board of Zoning Appeals, showing a 60 by 100 tent. Mr. Lloyd, who is representing Mr. Ingram in today's application, has actually revised the location of the tent, although it has not been revised on the plan itself. But Mr. Lloyd and I have worked out the location of the tent, and in order to meet the minimum 200-foot separation from the fuel pumps at the Exxon on the Run to the north, and in order to meet the 10-foot side setback in the light industrial zoning district along that southern property line, the tent has been revised to a 60 by 90 tent, and is actually, of course, 10 feet smaller in width. But it does now meet that minimum separation requirement from the fuel pumps by about 5 feet. Mr. Lloyd and I both measured out approximately 205 feet from that nearest fuel pump at the Exxon on the Run. As I mentioned, the applicant is requesting both the July 4th and New Year's time frames. The tent's hours of operation will be from 8 a.m. until 11 p.m., with the exception of July 3rd, 4th, and December 31st, during which time the tent will be open until midnight. The site passed its initial zoning inspection and has now passed its initial codes inspection as well, and is codes and zoning compliant. The area that was that previously housed where the building was previously located has been seeded and strawed. As those of you who are on the ride around this morning saw, that area has been seeded and strawed, and grass is beginning to grow there now. All other distance requirements are met. I did go to the Shanghai restaurant, which is within 250 feet, but I did verify that they do not sell alcohol on premises for on-site consumption. They told me that they sell only soft drinks. and the like. The tent operator will properly dispose of solid waste as needed. The applicant has indicated that his tent operator will have a vehicle on site overnight for security, and that there will be a portable toilet brought in on site for the duration of the selling season. As we saw today during the ride around the property, there's no business on the subject property, just an asphalt parking lot. That asphalt parking lot has 2 points of ingress, egress into it, and has a number of existing striped parking spaces that can be utilized for the tent employees and customers. Staff recommends the same 7 conditions that I read aloud during Ms. Smith's application, and an 8th condition that a temporary barrier must be installed during the selling season along the edge of the area that has been seeded and strawed, so that there is no vehicular travel or parking on this grass area. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing, and Mr. Chip Lloyd, representing Mr. Ingram, is in attendance if you have any questions for him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, thank you. Mr. Lloyd, anything you'd like to add to this application? Thank you. All right, then at this time, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll go ahead and declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion.
Make a motion that we approve the special use permit, subject to all staff comments.
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Mr. Lloyd, that application's been granted. Thank you. All right, we'll keep moving here. Next item on the agenda is application Z09037 by Mr. Jake Lloyd for Mid-American Distributors, requesting a special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment, a seasonal fireworks retailer, in a commercial highway zone for property located at 2441 through 2449 Old Fort Parkway. Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Rogers. The subject property is known as the Stone Trace Commons Shopping Center. It houses Kroger, located at the corner of Old Fort Parkway and Cason Lane. This is the first time that we've had a temporary vending application on this particular site. First time, more specifically, that we've had a fireworks application for this particular site. The site does appear to meet all of the distance requirements. The applicant is just making a request for the 4th of July selling season. His hours of operation will be from 8 to 10, with the exception of July 3rd and 4th, during which time he'll be open until midnight. The site's passed its initial codes and zoning inspections after the application was made, and the size of the proposed tent is going to be 40 by 60. A portable restroom will be brought in on site, and the applicant will handle solid waste daily as needed. One thing that I did want to bring up, and I instructed Mr. Lloyd to make contact with the bank next door. This is just to the south of the Green Bank. One of the concerns that I had was that one of its means of ingress in and out of the site was going to be entirely blocked by the tent. You can see the 40 by 60 tent will be in this area right here, which is kind of a surplus parking area directly across the street from Ritter's Frozen Custard, which I must say that I frequent quite often, and I'm sure it shows, you see the 40 by 60 tent is kind of in that surplus parking area. The means of ingress and egress into the bank site, which is actually its own separate lot of record, is the teller, drive-through teller goes through here, and there's actually a two-way access point here, which leads back to this exit entrance onto Cason Lane. The tent would actually block this means of ingress, egress. So and Lot 1, which is the main lot of Stone Trace Commons, which houses the Kroger, is actually recorded as a cross-access easement for all of the out parcels, which this bank is on an out parcel. I recommended to Mr. Lloyd that he try to make contact with the bank manager and give him a heads up that he was making this request, because it would involve one of the access points to his site. To Mr. Lloyd's credit, he did attempt to make contact, and according to Mr. Lloyd, has not been contacted back by the bank manager. But he did attempt to make that contact and make the bank aware of this request. With that being said, as I mentioned, the site passed its initial codes and zoning inspections, does not take up more than 25% of the required parking, and appears to meet all other standards set forth in our zoning ordinance. If the board approves this application, staff recommends the standard 7 conditions, and in addition to those 7 conditions, staff recommends that the applicant must also install a barricade at the access point from the bank site into the subject parking lot for the entire time that the tent is in place. And I'll show you the area that I'm talking about. You'll see here, what we don't want to have happen is have bank patrons come in here and find that there is no way in and out of this area, and then end up being in a kind of an Austin Powers kind of 3-point turn, if you've ever seen the Austin Powers movies, and he's trying to do a 3-point turn in a narrow hallway. At any rate, so they're looking to barricade this area here, or we're recommending that they barricade this area here so that folks will automatically know to go over to the north side of the property and exit the site. And Mr. Lloyd said he has no problem doing that. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions, and Mr. Lloyd is in attendance if you have any questions for him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley?
So they can, if they come through the drive-through area there, that's the arrows pointing south from the north on the entryway to Lot 2 there is just a one-way access into the bank property. Is that right?
If we could put the overhead back up. Are you talking about right here?
Talking about right there.
Yes, yes. I think they have.
So they're not free to leave on that.
I don't believe so.
So they would need to circle around the building and leave.
Yes.
On the east side of the property.
Actually, the north side of the property.
Northeast.
Yes, I've got it oriented.
I'm with you.
On the map, which is a full 2-way access. I brought this concern to Mr. Balachandra, our traffic engineer, and he was not considering there was a full 2-way access in and out of the site, other than the access that would be blocked. He was not overly concerned about the applicant's request.
And did the bank stay on our list of people who got a letter about the request?
Yes. And the sign has been, the sign is essentially right there in front of the bank as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Mr. Lloyd, anything you'd like to add to this application?
Not a lot, other than when I brought this to Mr. Blomley, he did, he's not kidding, he knew exactly where it was. He was like, I frequent there often. So, but anyways, that bank, I called about 4 times and left a message with the manager and on his personal voicemail, and never received a call. And ironically, every single time I called, he was in a meeting. So I'm presuming that, just my assumption, that they don't let people talk to the bank manager. I guess unless you have a pretty good reason, or he knows you or something. Anyways, the other thing I'd like to point out is that we don't have a problem putting a barricade at all, but when cars pull in, like, they actually have to come in and take a left in order to go to the drive-throughs. That's the way the bank's set up. That picture didn't really show it, but they pull in and then instinctively they would take a left if they plan on doing any banking, which I don't know why they would really pull in there otherwise. But nonetheless, we're more than happy to do whatever we need to do, and as always, I appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Lloyd. Any questions for Mr. Lloyd? If not, then we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we approve the application with the 8 conditions set by the board.
that include the barriers?
Yes, sir.
I'll second the motion. I guess I just somehow think when they start putting up big barrels over there, the bank's going to be not happy, but I don't know, not to hear from them or have any other input from them. Having been given notice and signs posted and Mr. Lloyd's attempt to contact them, I don't know. I mean, and if traffic's okay with it, they may not be that big an issue for them. It would just seem to me that that might pose a problem for their customers, but I don't think it would cause any safety concerns with the barriers up there. People used to going over there would be blocked from doing so.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion?
Was there a second on the floor?
I seconded it, and then I kept talking.
All right, if there's no further discussion, then all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Mr. Lloyd, that application has been granted. We'll move to your next application, which is application Z09038 by Mr. Jake Lloyd for Mid-America Distributors, requesting a special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment, a seasonal fireworks retailer, in a commercial highway zone for property located at the southeast corner of Southeast Broad Street and Kensington Square Court. Mr. Blomley.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. I'm sure we're all familiar with this location. Mr. Lloyd has been approved at this location for the last 8 years, from 2001 through 2008. He doesn't really propose to change anything about the operation of this site from previous years. As I brought up every year, we have had complaints in the past, not in recent years, but we have had complaints, I think, during Mr. DeMassi's tenure about fireworks being shot off on site. But Mr. Lloyd has always said that he is committed to making sure that his operators know that no fireworks are to be shot off on site. And I guess we've never really been able to completely ascertain whether or not fireworks were ever set off on site. But Mr. Lloyd has indicated that his operators know that they are not to do that, and he will, I'm sure, reiterate that to them once again, just based on the comments that we've had from neighbors in the past. The proposed tent is 30 by 60, which would be the same size that he has used in years past. It meets all distance requirements. You can see it's a gravel lot, but it's one of the gravel lots that have been grandfathered in. And one of the things that Mr. Lloyd has to do every year in order to bring these gravel lots up to snuff, the grandfathered gravel lots, is to add some additional gravel to make sure that the tent itself and the parking surface are entirely on gravel and not on grass. The board approves this application. Staff recommends the following conditions, the standard 7 conditions that I will not read again. And number 8, all grass and weeds growing up through the existing gravel must be removed and or killed, as no grass surfaces are allowed for the placement of the tent and for vehicular travel and parking. Number 9, no vehicular access will be allowed to Southeast Broad Street. He does not plan on having that. That's just more of a placeholder comment. And a 10th comment that I neglected to go back out and reinspect the property. There were some weeds and grass issues when we did our inspections earlier this month, and Mr. Lloyd is uncertain whether or not the property owner has taken care of that, but he is committed to making sure that it is that those weeds and grass issues are taken care of before the actual selling season begins. So a 10th condition would be that the all property maintenance issues must be resolved prior to the selling season. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions, and Mr. Lloyd is in attendance if you have any questions for him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley?
Mr. Blomley, is this property right next to the Dollar General?
Yes, sir. In fact, that building, if you put up the overhead again for me, this building here and the associated parking lot, that's actually the Dollar General.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I don't have a direct interest in this application, but close clients of mine, and I've dealt with this property on title work and acquisition work, so I'll probably refrain from any, even though I don't have a direct conflict, I would probably refrain from discussion or voting on this particular application. I think I did that last year as well. So I'll try to remain consistent.
Then, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Mr. Lloyd, anything you'd like to add to this application, sir? Pretty
Just one
talkative.
quick thing. I contacted the landowner, and he was supposed to have mowed that lot. And I told him if he, for whatever reason, it wasn't going to get mowed, to please let me know, and I'll do it myself. And I'll probably do it again anyways before the tent goes up, because that's just what I do. But anyways, I appreciate it as always, and I'll be out of y'all's hair till next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Pretty talkative today. We usually can't get a word out of you most of the time. All right. At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. Seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion.
Chairman Rogers, I'll make a motion that we approve the special use permit, including all conditions made, all 10 conditions made on this application.
A second.
Now we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, Mr. Lloyd, that application has been granted. Thank you very much for coming in. Well, I guess we'll see you next year. All right, I'll come back to Ms. Smith. Application Z09039 by Ms. Julie Smith for Absolute Fireworks, requesting a special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment, seasonal fireworks retailer, in a commercial local zone for property located at 3216 Memorial Boulevard. Mr. Blomley.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. This is the first time that we've seen a application for a temporary fireworks stand this location as well. The property is zoned CL, commercial local. It's the former location of a motel. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's just to the north of the Shell station at the corner of Cedar View and Memorial Boulevard. That motel burned down about a year or two ago, and since then the site has sat vacant. Of course, the motel was demolished. However, the parking lot remains, and just to the rear of the motel, there is an existing mobile home park, and as I mentioned, there is a Shell station convenience store just to the south of the subject property, and directly across the street is a Sir Pizza. The site is a little bit unusual, especially in light of the fact that the building is not there anymore, which oddly enough, this is the second application that we've had today where there's no building there, but there's a parking lot. The applicant initially submitted an application for a 30 by 60 tent that you can see where we have whited out the location of the tent. She's revised that to a 30 by 45 tent because one of the things that we thought was important on the site was circulation around the tent in this manner. As you can see, there's one access point here onto Memorial Boulevard, and we did not want traffic to back up in this area right here so close to the access point onto Memorial Boulevard. We wanted traffic to not only be able to circulate this way around the site, but to be able to circulate this way as well, so that there would be full circulation around this large grassy island here. Currently, along where the building used to be located, there's actually a pretty steep drop-off point. And then this area down here, the grade drops a little bit too for this excess parking area down here as well. The site meets the minimum separation requirements from alcohol sales, which actually right across the street, Sir Pizza sells alcohol, but for consumption on premises, but it's about 260 to 265 feet away from the proposed tent location, so it meets that requirement. And it does, the proposed location of the tent does exceed the minimum distance from the fuel pumps next door to the south. so all distance requirements are met. Let's get you oriented with some photographs of the site. This is looking across the street to the south at the assisted living facility. Across the street to the north, the Sir Pizza. This is the site looking. This is looking on the site south towards the Shell station. As you can see, there's a fence and a tree row separating those two properties. This is looking directly back from Memorial Boulevard into the site. You can see the mobile homes, the nearest mobile homes, the mobile home park, directly to the rear of the subject property. It wouldn't be a Board of Zoning Appeals meeting without seeing that beautiful car in one of the shots.
Are they going to have that towed off the property? Is that a code violation? Storage of junk automobiles?
That may constitute a codes violation. I'm not sure. I'll have to get with Mr. Whitaker about that. I think he would probably consider it a classic, but that's just my opinion. At any rate, the applicant is only applying for the July 4th selling season. The site did pass its initial zoning inspection and has passed its codes inspection. However, our codes department has indicated that there are areas on site where there are still some weeds and grass issues, and the front area has been mowed, but the back area and the northern portion of the site still need to be a little upkeep done on them. So we would ask that any approval be made conditioned upon all the weeds and grass issues, property maintenance issues be taken care of. The tent will be compliant with the 42-foot front setback along Memorial Boulevard. The applicant will bring in a temporary power pole as well as a portable restroom. Because of the fairly steep drop-off at the eastern edge of the parking lot to where the motel previously stood, staff recommends that the BZA require a barricade be erected for safety reasons during the selling season on the eastern edge of the parking lot so that drivers are clearly aware of where that ledge is. In addition, there's a large grass island in the middle of the site with one side uncurbed, and staff recommends that this side of the grassy island also be barricaded so that customers are not tempted to park on the grass island. And all this could consist of could be some orange construction fencing, which would do the trick, which would be bright enough to let people know so that they don't drive in any of these areas. And that I won't be repetitious, but that condition number 8 in the listed recommended conditions identifies those two areas that staff recommends to be barricaded. And of course, the 9th condition would be that all property maintenance issues be resolved prior to the selling season. And with that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Ms. Smith is here if you have any questions for her.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley?
Mr. Blomley, the access to the trailer park is not shared with this location, is that right?
That's correct, and I'll actually put up the aerial. The access to the mobile home park is actually off of Cedar View Drive, which is a small substandard county road adjacent to the Shell station. There are actually 2 private drives that go into that mobile home park from Cedar View Drive.
So there is no access from Memorial?
That's correct.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Ms. Smith, anything you'd like to add to this application? All right. At this time, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, who would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion.
Chairman, I move for approval of special use permit subject to staff comments.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Ms. Smith, that application has been granted. We'll next move to application Z09040 by Ms. Julie Smith for Absolute Fireworks, requesting a special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment, seasonal fireworks retailer, in a heavy industrial zone for property located at 2105 North Thompson Lane. Mr. Blomley.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Subject property has been approved once before, and it was in 2007 for a seasonal fireworks retailer. Property is located at 2105 North Thompson Lane, and unfortunately, I know that many of you are familiar with the circumstances that this property finds itself in. It's the old Cummings Sign Company building that Swanson Development owns that was ravaged by the Good Friday tornado last month. The applicant has made application for a seasonal fireworks retailer on this site for just the July 4th selling season, and she intends to use the same setup as was used by Mr. Stoker, the applicant, back in 2007. And I'll show you the aerial photograph now of the site. Here's the subject building that was heavily damaged by the storm. It's paved all the way up until about this point here. The parking lot is from here to here, and the fireworks tent will be located in this area, which was the same area that it was approved for in 2007. Ms. Smith is aware of the outstanding codes issues on the property, and one of the things that we as staff have tried to do in an attempt to work with Ms. Smith due to these unforeseen circumstances that occurred and due to the amount of cleanup and work that Swanson Development would have to do to bring the entire site into compliance, is that we have modified our expectations that the entire site, because the site is so large and not all of the site will be utilized, but that instead of the entire site being in compliance with all city codes and ordinances by the selling season, that the area in the immediate vicinity of the proposed fireworks tent be in compliance with all codes and ordinances, including all property maintenance issues, which there are still several out there which need to be addressed. And with that being said, we also recommend that the areas that are still seen as not being safe be barricaded from adding any more public traffic into those areas, such as the building itself, and so that we can keep the activity associated with this fireworks sales area limited to a certain small area on site, and keep the other areas free from the public traffic. The applicant is just requesting the July 4th selling season. Her hours of operation will be from 10 a.m. until 10 p.m., except on July 3rd and 4th, which days she'll be open until midnight. She is approximately 315 feet from the nearest fire hydrant, which meets minimum requirements. There was a fuel pump on site in 2007, but I have field verified this. It is no longer there. I suppose that it was destroyed at some point during the tornado or removed prior to that. The size of the tent is proposed to be 30 by 60, and as proposed will meet all minimum setback requirements. There is currently adequate parking on site, paved parking to accommodate the applicant's use. We do ask one thing that, and this is consistent with where she has identified the tent to be located, because there is some industrial traffic associated with this site, for example, with the pallet company that is to the rear of where Ms. Smith is looking to locate, that the tent be located as proposed so as to keep the main entrance free from being blocked or have cars parked there so as to block the access aisle for those larger vehicles, the industrial traffic that's heading back towards the pallet company in the rear. Show you some pictures right now of the site itself. This is the area where the tent would be located. As you can see, it's a paved surface. Of course, all of these cars would be removed by that time. I think those are vehicles, employees of the pallet company or employees of the folks who are doing cleanup. And this is looking back towards the pallet company. As you can see, all of this is paved. This is looking back towards the building itself. If I recall correctly, all of the entrances into the building from the outside are already barricaded and have been done so in accordance with the order from the Codes Department. This is looking down at the other end of the building. As you can see, there's even a fence separating the gravel portion of the parking lot from the paved portion of the parking lot. And this is looking down the front of the site, back, turning around back towards Thompson Lane. If the board approves this application, staff recommends the standard 7 conditions, and in addition, the following 3 conditions. The area in the immediate vicinity of the proposed fireworks tent needs to be free from property maintenance violations. Number 9, the property owner needs to continue to make satisfactory progress as determined by the Building and Codes Director, who is present if you have any questions for him, towards bringing the entire site into codes compliance. So what we're saying there is we understand that the site is very large and only a minute portion of the property is being utilized in this fireworks operation, but that the property owner needs to continue to make progress to a level satisfactory to Mr. Whitaker. And number 10, a barricade needs to be put in place so that the general public is deterred from going on to areas on site that are deemed unsafe, subject to the approval of the Building and Codes Director. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing. Mr. Whitaker is also here if you have any questions for him. And unless I forget, Ms. Smith is here as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? Mr. Blomley, can you put that picture back up on the overhead? I think it's the very first picture.
The one with the red trucks in the background?
Yes. And this relates to actually the agenda item under staff reports and other business. Can you move the picture over a little bit to the right? Yeah.
Yes.
All right. On the left side there, you see that pole?
Yes.
That is a stealth cell tower.
Yes.
All right. That doesn't have any racks hanging off. All the antennas are contained within the pole, and actually there's a ball on top of it that makes it look like a flagpole. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I remember I was on the BZA when that application for that cell tower came before us, and they asked us, "Do you want us to hang a flag on it?" And we debated the issues of maintenance and that sort of thing. But that I wanted to show to you and to everybody. That's what is a stealth cell tower.
Sure.
Okay. Sorry about that. Digress. All right. Yeah.
Understood. It was handy to have that photograph.
Yeah, it was very timely.
That's why you included it in the shot.
Yeah. That's right. I was thinking of y'all.
Right.
It wasn't just a random photograph.
Yeah. Very clever. Very clever. All right, Ms. Smith, anything you'd like to add to this application? And at this time, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further comments or motion.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we approve the application with the 10 conditions set by the staff.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. Ms. Smith, that application has been granted as well. Thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to signed variance requests, application S09041 by Mr. Ryan Taylor of Jocelyn Signs for super speed wash, requesting a variance from section 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which prohibits a sign placed in or over a public utility or drainage easement on property located at 3320 Franklin Road. Ms. Kerr. Review that application for us, please.
The applicant, Ryan Taylor, representing IPM Partnerships for Super Speed Wash, is requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which prohibits a foundation or sign placed in or over a public utility or drainage easement without the consent of the easement holder and Board of Zoning Appeals approval. This sign is location proposed at 3320 Franklin Road is within a planned unit development. The applicant is requesting to install one internally illuminated freestanding wall sign with 20 square feet of an opaque background display area and an overall height of 6 feet. The sign will be located within a 40-foot water and sewer easement and a consolidated utility district water easement. The sign itself will be within the easement, but the water department, City of Murfreesboro Water Department requested that this sign be placed at least 10 feet from their actual line inside of the easement. The agreement for a sign in a City of Murfreesboro easement has been signed by the Murfreesboro Water and Sewer Department and the Director of Building and Codes, as well as an approval letter from CUD's project coordinator. And due to the sensitivity of the placement of the sign in regards to the sewer line, staff recommends that the sign be located on-site by a Tennessee registered engineer or surveyor, and that a form of certification of sign placement be provided prior to permitting, and all other setbacks and regulations will be upheld. And the applicant is here to answer any questions that you might have.
All right, thank you, Ms. Kerr. Any questions for Ms. Kerr? All right, Mr. Taylor, anything you'd like to add to this application, sir?
I'm actually, I'm Ryan, I'm not Ryan Taylor, I'm Ryan Terrell, the owner of the Super Speedway.
All right.
Different Ryan here.
Ryan Terrell?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Terrell. All right, then at this time, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion.
Ms. Carter, we need to add the condition that the sign would be placed, what did you say they requested, within 10 feet of the existing sewer line?
Yeah, and the placement has been made by the Water and Sewer Department. They have coordinated with the Water and Sewer Department where the actual sign can go, but we're just going to have a certification of placement that coincides with the drawings that we received from the applicant, and it coincides with an engineer's stamp drawing that says that they did place it in that location.
Okay. So if we recommend approval subject to staff comments and requirements, then you're satisfied that that'll get you where you need to be?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I move for approval of the variance subject to comments of staff.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Mr. Terrell, that application has been granted. I appreciate your patience today. Thank you. Okay, next item on the agenda, application S09042 by Mr. Randy Adcock for Cook Neon Signs for First National Bank, requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro Sign Ordinance, which prohibits a sign placed in or over a public utility or drainage easement on property located at 2230 Mercury Boulevard.
Good afternoon, Chairman
Good
Rogers.
afternoon.
I'm Brian Hardison.
Mr. Hardison, that's right. Thank you.
Thank you. The applicant, Randy Adcock, representing First National Bank of Murfreesboro, is requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro Sign Ordinance, which prohibits a foundation or sign placed in or over a public utility drainage easement without consent of the easement holder and the Board of Zoning Appeals. The sign location proposed at 2230 Mercury Boulevard is within a commercial highway zone. The applicant is requesting permission to erect one internally illuminated ground sign with 75 square feet and overall height of 16 feet. The sign will be located within a 42-foot water and sewer easement. The agreement for a sign in a City of Murfreesboro easement has been signed by the Murfreesboro Water and Sewer Department and the Director of the Building and Codes. Due to the sensitivity of placement of the sign in regards to the sewer lines, staff recommends that the sign be located on site by a Tennessee registered engineer surveyor, and that the certificate of sign placement be provided prior to permitting. The application will comply with all other setbacks and regulations. I don't believe Mr. Adcock's here, but I will answer any questions that you may have.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hardison. Any question for Mr. Hardison?
Is this sign already up? Is this
No, sir.
forgiveness or permission?
No,
Okay.
sir.
All right, thank you, sir. At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward. Seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion.
I'll make a motion, Chairman Rogers, we approve the sign variance subject to staff comment.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, that application has been granted. Finally, under sign variance requests, application S09043 by Mr. David Seals of Boom Sign and Lighting for Airport Plaza Green Acres, LLC, requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which prohibits a sign placed in or over a public utility or drainage easement on property located at 2528 Old Fort Parkway. Mr. Hardison.
The applicant, David K. Seals, representing Airport Plaza Green Acres, LLC, is requesting a variance from Section 25 1/4, 24A22 of the City of Murfreesboro sign ordinance, which prohibits a foundation or sign placed in or over a public utility or drainage easement without consent of the easement holder and Board of Zoning Appeals approval. The sign proposed at 2528 Old Fort Parkway is within a commercial highway zone. The applicant is requesting permission to erect one internally illuminated ground sign with 72 square feet, display area, and an overall height of 16 feet. The sign will be located within a 20-foot sewer easement. The agreement for a sign in a City of Murfreesboro easement has been signed by the Murfreesboro Water and Sewer Department, the Director of Building and Codes. Due to the sensitivity of placement of the sign in regards to sewer lines, staff recommends that the sign be located on site by a Tennessee registered engineer or surveyor, and that a Form 4 certificate of sign placement be provided prior to permitting. The applicant will comply with all other setbacks and regulations. And Mr. Seals is here if you have any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hardison. Any question from Mr. Hardison? Thank you, sir. Mr. Seals, anything you'd like to add to this application, sir? All right. At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we approve with the recommendations of the staff.
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Mr. Seals, that application has been approved. Thank you. Again, appreciate your patience today. All right, staff reports and other business. Update on application Z09024 by Ms. Margot Chapman of Crown Castle for Cricket Communications for property located at 1134 Old Lascassas Road. Mr. Blomley.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. As promised last month, I wanted to, at the very least, have an update for you on Ms. Chapman's request, and with regards to the what I found out with my research regarding the 2001 tower approval for that property at 1134 Old Lascassas. I went back and I watched the Board of Zoning Appeals meeting from 2001. It was a 3-hour public hearing, and that was a continuation of an earlier public hearing that I can only guess how long the first one was, that they needed to continue it for an additional 3 hours. But Mr. Rogers was there, and I saw him, and
had fewer gray hairs then.
Glasses too, might I add. Right. But what I came to the conclusion of is that the terminology stealth tower was used in the motion, but what was presented by the applicant was that it was proposed to be a monopole tower with flush-mounted antennas. And there was, during the course of that 3-hour public hearing, there was nothing that was said to change that, what the applicant was proposing. And when the terminology stealth was used, it did not appear that it appeared that it was more reinforcing what the applicant was proposing. With that being said, the tower is still in violation because it's got one antenna that is not flush mounted. And I think that based on what I saw when watching the meeting and looking at the materials that were in that 2001 folder, what that condition should have read was basically reiterating what the applicant had proposed, was that it was going to be a monopole with flush-mounted towers only. And what I found out in my research and in working with Mr. Scobie, who works with Ms. Chapman, is that antenna that is not flush-mounted, and that in common parlance sometimes referred to as a crow's nest, was actually changed out without any kind of permits or permission. It was changed out in violation. One of the characters originally had gone with a flush-mounted antenna on that tower and wanted more capacity, so changed out that flush-mounted antenna, which was compliant with a non-compliant, non-flush-mounted antenna. In talking with our codes department, no building permit is required for a co-location, but a building permit is required if they are building equipment on the ground, and also an electrical permit is required for the electrical work that is done. We only had records of the permit records for the tower and the initial co-location, which was flush-mounted, and that was by Sprint. And then we had permits for another co-location, which was also flush-mounted. So the one that was not flush-mounted was never, city staff never saw that. Upon finding out that was indeed in violation, I notified Mr. Scobie and Ms. Chapman, as well as Mr. Stroop, in writing that there were 3 violations with regards to the tower. One, that middle antenna was not flush-mounted, and that was in violation of the original conditions of approval, as well as what was represented by the original applicant, Sprint. Number 2, that because of the subdivision of that property, that tower was in violation of its minimum setback requirements. And number 3, that the required landscape buffer along the eastern property line was actually on the adjacent property owner's property, Dr. Agarwal's property as well, considering that it was after that subdivision. Another thing that was that I noticed was that in the 2001 application, Mr. Stroop committed in writing to not building anything within that 50-foot fall zone, within that 50-foot fall radius. That was never recorded as any type of easement. It probably should have been recorded as some type of no build easement, so that the integrity of that fall radius and the condition of the Board of Zoning Appeals approval could have stood and could have been communicated to future property owners. That was never recorded. So I had several discussions with Mr. Stroop and with Crown Castle. Subsequently, I met with them yesterday afternoon after the Memorial Day weekend, discussed with them several options. With regards to the fall radius and the landscape buffer, those can be handled with the recording of easements and with the application for a setback variance. But what they opted to do, which obviously I told them not applying for a setback variance is the preferable option to see if things can be worked out without variances first. They're going to be in discussions with Dr. Agarwal about the possible acquisition of additional property and re-subdivision so that it would not be necessary to request a variance back before the Board of Zoning Appeals for that rear setback violation that is in existence right now. I think that they are at Crown Castle. They've been very responsive, and they took to heart. And I tried to drive home as much as possible that the Board of Zoning Appeals was very serious about this tower meeting with the original 2001 approval, and that it was, in my opinion, that not only, and I know Mr. Halliburton said that Mr. Stroop's property outside the leased area needed to come into compliance. But it was I took from last month's meeting that the violations on the tower needed to be remedied first before the board would consider any amendments to the special use permit and the height variance. And they have taken that to heart, and they are diligently working on remedying those violations and exploring all avenues to remedy those violations prior to coming back before the Board of Zoning Appeals for any type of additional action or amendments. With regards to Mr. Stroop's violations outside of the lease area, his site plan is very near being approved. He's actually put down some pavement on there a little bit prematurely, but he is working towards coming into compliance. He's removed not all, but most of the materials on site. I believe he's actually looking at having a storage building placed on one of his apartment properties so that he doesn't have to store his equipment there at which he uses to maintain his apartment properties there outside in the back of that parking lot, that he can actually keep those in an enclosure in a building on the properties that he actually uses that equipment to maintain. And Mr. Stroop knows that he needs to bring that property into compliance, and he's diligently working towards that. So just wanted to let you know that we as staff have been working on those issues. The issues are manifold, so it's taken a little while to flesh them out, but I think that both Mr. Stroop and Crown Castle are going to be diligently working to remedy those issues.
Great. Well, we sure do appreciate that, Matthew. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
All right. Is there any other business? If not, then we are adjourned.